Chapter 101. Rias vs. Riser 4. Raiding Game Field. Currently at the top of the new school building, Rias is confronting Riser with a barrier shield in front of her blocking the fireballs coming her way. Riser looked at Rias, whose clothes now are turned into rags, hiding nothing, and smirked and said, "Rias, you might as well forfeit. It will only cause you more pain and humiliation if you continue in your condition." Rias gritted her teeth and said, "There is no way I am giving up after coming this far. After defeating your whole peerage, except Ravel, there is no way that I am stopping when I am only a step away from my freedom." Riser snorted and said, "You cannot defeat Riser anyway, so why continue this one-sided battle?" Rias didn't said anything and fired a wave of her power of destruction towards Riser, destroying his hand in process, which immediately set on fire and regenerated. Riser then looked at her with an uninterested expression and said, "Well, it does not matter if you forfeit now or not. The amount of damage you have taken will slowly result in your loss." Rias glared at Riser and wanted to retort, but knew that what Riser said was true. She was not sure for how long will she be able to remain conscious. She has depleted most of her demonic power, and the attacks that Riser's attacks were also not completely blocked by the shield. Riser then said, "Let's get a bit serious." Riser is getting bored, and started to prepare for a big attack and started gathering a lot of flames in his hands. Riser then launched his attack in Rias's direction, but before it could connect, a sound was heard. Explosion, dragon shot, and a red energy wave clashed with the flames coming in Rias's direction, making a huge explosion as a result. Though Rias was not completely saved as she got blown away by the aftermath of the explosion. Rias was about to crash to a wall behind her, but before they could collide, Kaneko caught her. Riser looked at the two new girls who were standing in front of her and said, "Oh, the pawn and the rook has came to save their master." He then looked at Isami and saw her red gauntlet in her hand and said, "You must be the wilder of the boosted gear." Riser has to say, Riser is impressed with the power you just showed. Riser is willing to make you Riser's woman after Riser's marriage with Rias. How about it? Isami continued to be on her guard and said, "Sorry, but I am Tatsuyas." Riser, who heard the name, suddenly got pale and said, "Then Riser guessed that there is no way for you to be Riser's woman." Riser apologizes. There is no way Riser wants to be on Tatsuya-san's bad side. It is better to apologize to her even if she is a low class. Riser then turned serious and said, "But even if you were Tatsuya-san's woman, Riser is not going to hold back. Riser will certainly defeat you." Isami, who was still on her guard, asked, "Kaneko-chan, is press fine?" Kaneko looked towards Isami and said in her neutral voice, "She is conscious but has sustained a lot of injuries. She will not be able to fight." Isami nodded her head and said, "Then let's finish him on our own." Kaneko came by her side and cracked her knuckles. Isami then raised her gauntlet and said, "Kaneko-chan, buy me some time, I will start boosting." Boost. Kaneko nodded and launched towards Riser while readying a punch, while Riser looked at her with a smirk. Kaneko, who saw the smirk on Riser's face, got a bit angry and started punching him, and even though she was doing some damage, Riser was getting regenerated immediately. Kaneko gritted her teeth and was about to hit punch Riser on the face, but before she was able to, Riser punched Kaneko with a fist covered with fire and stopped her attack and made Kaneko back away. Kaneko, who was now again beside Isami, groaned in pain, even though the punch in itself was not enough to cause much damage. The fire around it burned her skin a bit even after her defense as a rook was high. Isami then said, "Don't worry, I am ready." Boost. Explosion. Isami then channeled her magic power to a spot and then punched forward while shouting, "Dragon shot," and a huge red energy wave launched towards Riser, engulfing him along with most of the building behind him. Isami, who was now breathing heavily, looked at the dust cloud in front of her and asked, "Did we get him?" But as she said that, fire began to ignite in front of her and Riser materialized in front of him completely unscathed, but his breathing a bit uneven. He then looked at Isami and said, "That attack took a lot out of Riser." He then covered both his hand in fire and said, "But too bad, you were facing an immortal." He was about to attack but suddenly jumped away. At the same moment when he jumped away, lightning hit that spot and caused a hole in the roof. Era, you were able to dodge my attack even at such speed. As expected of you, Phoenix-sama." Riser looked at the sky and said, and to be able to make Riser dodge the attack instead of taking it head on, Riser is impressed, Priestess of Thunder. Riser then narrowed his eyes and said, but Riser has no time to chat. Riser had already wasted a lot of Riser's precious time, and then fired towards both Akino's and Isami's group. Both the groups dodged the attacks and then gathered together, and Akino asked, "How's the situation? Do you think that we can win?" Kaneko looked at Akino and said, "President is injured and cannot fight anymore, and my attacks have no effect on him. But Isami-senpai's was able to make him exhausted quite a bit, some more continuous attacks, and we might be able to finish him." Akino nodded and looked at Riser with her guard up and said, "Hear this, we will only get one chance. Use the strongest attacks that you have. Kaneko, Kiba, you are up first. Isami, start boosting and attack immediately after me." All three of them nodded their head and said, "Roger." Kaneko then started gathering magic in her fists and again launched at Riser. Riser, who was now serious unlike before, didn't stand still and launched his flames at her with full intensity. But before the flames could attack Kaneko, Kiba came as well and slashed his sword at the flames, which started absorbing them, making Riser's eyes widen and say, "Another sacred gear." And immediately Kaneko and Kiba started slashing and punching him with their full strength, and this time Riser actually felt pain because Kaneko's fists, which were covered with magic, as well Kiba, who was using his fire-absorbing sword, were hindering his healing quite a bit. Riser glared at them and suddenly erupted his body into flames and said, "Don't underestimate Riser," and the flames started to run wild. At the administration room, Tatsuya looked at the fight taking place on the roof through the monitor and thought, the anime really didn't showcase Riser's true might. Now I know why he is able to win all the 8 games he played seriously. This match might be a bit tricky now. Back to the raiding game field. The members of the Grimoire Peerage were sweating under the heat of Riser's flames and were very surprised by the power he suddenly released. Akino looked at the scene in front of her and shouted, "Both of you fall back." Kiba and Kaneko, who heard their queen's order, immediately jumped back and were groaning in pain. Their bodies were burnt very badly and now their movements were hindered. Akino, who was preparing her spell, looked at his team and said, "Be prepared, it is going to get a bit chaotic here. Make sure to not get caught in the attack," and then executed her magic. Suddenly black clouds started to form around the building. Akino then looked at Riser and said, "Take this," and a huge bolt of thunder hit Riser head on. Ado. Riser, who was hit by the thunder, was screaming in pain and was healing his body continuously so as to not get defeated. Akino, who was surprised to see Riser still enduring the attack, started to get worried and looked at Isami and said, "Isami, are you ready? My attack is going to stop any instant now. You have to hit him immediately after that." Isami looked at Akino with a serious expression and said, "I understand." She then looked at her gauntlet and said, "Drake, do you think that I am ready for that?" The gem on the gauntlet suddenly glowed and said, "You are more than ready, you just require a proper catalyst to fuel your emotions." Isami, who heard that, gritted her teeth and thought, "What catalyst I need now? I thought that if I increase my strength I will be able to handle it, but what should I do now?" Suddenly she heard a voice, "Isami, save me. The girls are trying to violate me. Hurry up." Isami, who heard Tatsuya's voice in her mind, started to imagine the situation that Tatsuya was in and shouted, "Don't touch him when I am not there. I want to do that as well. Welsh dragon, overbooster." And Isami's body began to emit a red glow. At the administration room, Sona was glaring at Tatsuya and said, "Why did you do that?" Tatsuya just waved his hand and said, "Well, she wanted motivation and I just gave her that. Don't fuss that much." Sona's gaze only intensified, and seeing that Tatsuya said, "You angry?" Sona nodded her head. Tatsuya then smirked and took out a photograph and said, "Hey, why don't we put up the photos of magical girls so and on the school notice board?" Hearing that, Sona's expression immediately changed and she said, "Well, I guess I can overlook this." Tatsuya nodded and looked back at the screen. Isami was covered in a red glow, and then the gauntlet shined again, and then both Isami and Drake shouted at the same time, "Boosted gear, balance breaker scale mail." The light then died down and revealed Isami covered in red draconic armor. All the people who looked at her were shocked that she was able to unleash the balance breaker. Isami then looked at Riser and said, "I have to beat this shit soon, otherwise all the fun that they are having with Tatsuya's body will be over. I want to do it as well," and started flying towards Riser at full speed. At the administration room, all the people who listened what Isami said had a complex feeling, and Tatsuya was twitching his lips. Sona then broke the silence and said, "Well, at least she has motivation." Tsubaki then interjected her and said, "But the source of that motivation is the problem." All of them then nodded their heads and looked at Tatsuya. Tatsuya then looked at all of them and asked, "What?" All of them then immediately said, thinking whether to really violate you now or not. Tatsuya, who saw the look in their eyes, immediately tied them again and said, "I should have not released them in the first place, and why are you looking at me with the same gaze as them, Graphia?" As soon as he asked the question, all the girls other than Graphia said in unison, "She wants the D." Tatsuya was speechless by their answer and decided to ignore them and looked back at the screen. Back at raiding game field, Isami, who was covered in the armor, started boosting once again and was waiting for the thunder to die down. Just as the attack died down, Isami launched at Riser and said, "Here I come," and started attacking Riser with all her might. Riser, who was feeling pain from all the attacks, started to attack Isami as well while he was still covered in flames. He attacked her blindly without caring for his defense and with his full power. He knew that his regeneration could stop any moment now and decided to finish them as soon as possible. Akino, who saw the brawl between the both of them, was a bit worried. She then looked at both Kaneko and Kiba and asked, "Can you guys still move?" Both of them were on the floor and tried to stand up but were unable to do so and said, "Sorry, Akino-san, but at best we can move our hands." Akino, who heard that, was a bit disheartened, but suddenly an idea came in her mind and she looked at both of them and asked, "Kiba, can you still wield your sword without moving?" Kiba, who heard her question, nodded his head. Akino then looked at Kaneko and asked, "And can you throw some with your strength to the height where both of them are fighting?" Kaneko looked at the sky to check the height and nodded her head. Akino got serious and said, "Listen, both of you, we have to finish this now. Kaneko, be prepared to throw Kiba at them, and Kiba, be ready to slash him with all your remaining strength. I will attack him with all the magic left in me. Listen, we have to create an opening for Isami to land a decisive blow on him to get this over with." Both Kiba and Kaneko turned serious and nodded their heads. Akino then sent the information to Isami through the transmitter and then said, "Let's do it." Kaneko then picked Kiba's legs and floated a bit by her wings but had pained expression on her face. She gritted her teeth and started to gain momentum by rotating, and once she was confident enough, she threw Kiba with all her might. Kiba formed two swords on his hands and started channeling his magic through them to make them more stronger. He then came closer to both of them and shouted, "Isami movie." Isami immediately got away from Riser, who was confused by her actions and was immediately slashed by Kiba. Akino didn't miss the opportunity and also fired all the lighting at Riser, making him groan in pain, but he was still resisting to go down. Akino gritted her teeth and then immediately fell on her knees and said, "That's all I had." And Kaneko came back to her, supported her. Kiba came flying towards them as well and said, "Now all we can do is believe on her." Both of them then nodded and then looked back at the sky. Riser, who was now completely healed but was breathing heavily, was angry and said, "You have made Riser angry, very angry. Now you will feel Riser's wrath," and started to gather all the remaining power in his body for the next attack. He didn't care anymore. The only thing that he now wanted was to defeat them. Whether it killed them or not was not his concern. Akino and the others who felt the sudden surge in power were shocked once again, but But then they heard a voice. No you don't boosted gear, full power. Boost 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 boost. Explosion. Isami then made a very large magic orb in front of her, which was almost of her size. Isami then said, "This is the best I got, full power dragon shot." And a huge wave which made all the others look at the attack with a shocked expression was launched at Riser, and almost half the school was destroyed by that. Riser, who took the attack head on, experienced a lot of pain and shouted, "Nuo," and then disappeared into wet light. Riser-sama retired. Isami came back to roof and was about to tell Rias that they won when she heard, Rias-sama retired. Hearing that the whole Grimmery peerage was shocked and looked back to see in the direction where Rias was only to see some light particles fading away. Since Riser-sama retired before Rias-sama, the winner of the game is Rias Grimmery. The peerage members then sighed in relief but were still not sure whether to be happy about it or not. At the administration room, Sona looked at the others in disbelief and said, "Well, that was anticlimactic." All of them nodded and their heads in approval. Tatsuya then closed his eyes and said, "You know, even if Rias got her so-called freedom, I don't think that it was worth it." All of them got surprised by his words and Grafia asked, "Why do you think so?" Tatsuya then opened his eyes and said, if Rias was defeated in the game, she would not be humiliated that much as she was an amateur. But since she won the game like this, her name will be recorded in the history as the first devil peerage who won the game, with the only piece that they lost being the king piece, which was not even able to defeat a single enemy. All of them who heard his words had their mouths open wide and were not sure whether to laugh or feel sad about Rias. Chapter 102. Acquaintance. After the raiding game was over, Tatsuya and his team went to meet Isami and the others. Isami, who saw them, asked, "Why the hell did you not call me while violating him?" The others looked at her with a deadpan expression and then told them what actually happened, making Isami sigh in relief. They all then congratulated them and then left back for Kuo. The next morning, everyone was present on the dining table except Kurumi, who came later, and just as she came, she raised her hand in the air and said, "Sup VRGANSSSS," while putting extra focus on the word virgin. The girls who were present in the room suddenly felt an arrow pierce them and looked at Kurumi with a hateful expression. Kurumi then walked towards Tatsuya and hugged her from behind and said, "Last night was awesome. Tatsuya, you were so intense that I can feel excited just from remembering about it. You were so good," she said while looking at the others, making all of them groan in anger. Then all of a sudden Miyuki stood up from her chair and said, "Now that does it. Oni-sama, let's go to the bedroom and make love right now." Tatsuya, who was not bothering interrupt their talk, said, "It is still too early in the morning." Miyuki's face suddenly crumbled, but then she said, "Then there is no problem if we do it at night, right?" All the girls who heard that perked up and looked at each other with a glare. Himari then said, "The problem is not that whether he will do it at night or not. The problem here is Dash." Karen then said, "Who would be doing it with him?" And their glares intensified. Kurumi, who was looking at the scene in front of her with amazement, suddenly had an idea and took out Tatsuya's phone without his knowledge, and then sent a message to some people and started grinning and said, "Now this will be interesting." Suddenly 3 magic circles appeared in the room, and then Kuroka, Yasaka, and a lady with black hair and golden eyes appeared out of them. All the members looked at the 3 of them in surprise, but suddenly all 3 of them shouted, "Which bitch dared Tio take his first time / virginity and why?" All of them were confused as to how did they know about that, but suddenly they heard someone laughing and all of them looked in the direction FR where the sound was coming from and saw Kurumi laughing loudly. Tatsuya then went towards her and asked with a smile, "Kurumi, were you the one who called them?" Kurumi stopped laughing after a while and then said, "Yup, I need to make my position clear after all." She then stood up and looked at the girls and said, "Listen, you virgins. I am the one who gathered you all to inform you that I, the great Kurumi, has taken my beloved Tatsuya's virginity. Now you're allowed to congratulate me." All the girls looked at her with a look of envy and angry and were about to attack her, but before they were able to do that, Tatsuya came closer to her and hit her head with some strength in her punch and said, "First of all, Yasaka isn't a virgin. Second, stop this nonsense at once." He then looked at the 3 newcomers and asked, "And what are you 3 doing here, Yasaka, Kuroka, Amaterasu? I most certainly believe that all 3 of you must be extremely busy, especially you Amaterasu and Yasaka." All 3 of them snorted and said that Vixen sent us a message that all of you were deciding who is going to have Tatsuya's second time. She even highlighted the words Tatsuya's second time in the message. Amaterasu then said, "This is more important than my work back home. After all, I was the one who nearly took your virginity when you visited me last time. How the hell could you do that to me after you did all that?" Tatsuya then looked at her and said, "You were the one who tried to take advantage of me by using a very powerful aphrodisiac. How the hell am I the one who took advantage of you? It is me who was being taken advantage of." Amaterasu then looked at him and said, "Anyway, you can compensate me by doing it with me right now. Let's go to your room right away." Just as she said that, all the girls glared at her and said, "Keep your hands off him. I am going to do it with him next / Naya." And all of them started arguing except Kurumi, who was looking at the scene in front of her with amusement. Tatsuya was finally able to resolve the matter somehow by promising them to do it with all of them sometime later, and they accepted after Tatsuya persuaded them, while releasing his aura and pressuring them, after a while. Soon all of 3 of them left, making Tatsuya sigh in relief. Time skip, evening. Later that day, Tatsuya received a call on his phone and saw that it was Azazel who was calling him. Tatsuya was a bit surprised to see that it was Azazel calling him, but soon he picked it up and said, "Moshi Moshi." Azazel then replied, "Moshi Moshi, I hope that I am not disturbing you, but I have a favor to ask of you." "What?" "You see, there is an acquaintance of mine that I told about the alcohol quality of your restaurant is very great. And that person wants to have a meal in your restaurant, so I would like you to make arrangements for him." "When and how many people?" Well, about the number I am not sure of, probably 4 or 5 people, and the arrangement should be done for tonight. Is your acquaintance troublesome? Don't worry, he may be a pervert, but I can assure you he have no bad intentions. Oh, you are calling someone a pervert, then he must be a severe case. Well, in any case, tell him the preparations will be done, and they only need to mention your name, and ended the call. Later that night, Tatsuya waited for the people that Azazel mentioned for quite a while, but still no one came. Tatsuya then gave an annoyed sigh and said, next time when Azazel comes, I will cast a genjutsu on him to make him see everyone as Miltan. He then closed his restaurant and then went back to his home. While he was lying on the bed sleeping, he suddenly felt someone enter his room. He then got up and saw that the ones who entered the room were Miyuki and Himari. Tatsuya looked at them and asked, what are you two doing this late at night? Both of them came closer to him and said, we want to do it with you tonight, Tatsuya/Oni-sama. Tatsuya looked at them with his eyes widened in surprise and said, didn't you say that you will do it some other say in the morning? Miyuki then said, but we are doing it on another day, see it already past midnight, the date has already changed. Tatsuya looked at both of them with a dumbfounded expression and sighed before saying, you both do know that when the others will know about this there will be chaos. Both of them nodded and said, it doesn't matter to us, once you fuck them as well they will stop complaining. Tatsuya was shocked by their answer and said, you both are very shameless. Both of them then smiled and said, we know that, and pushed Tatsuya on the bed and started to undress. Time skip, 2 hours later. Tatsuya was lying in between the two girls who were completely naked and were unconscious. Tatsuya looked at both of them and thought, normally they are very hostile of each other, but in bed both of them work together quite well. Tatsuya smiled at both of them, covered them with some sheets and kissed their foreheads. He was about to go to sleep himself when suddenly he felt a lot presences and that is strong ones in the town. He then sighed and said, they only came when both the people who were in charge of Kuo are in underworld. He then put some clothes on his body and decided to check on the situation. He then came out of his house and was about to fly towards the source but stopped when he noticed something. Why the hell are all of them moving towards my direction? Tatsuya thought about it for a while but soon shrugged it off and said, well, let's wait and see what will happen, and sat in front of his house. Soon he felt that a barrier field was made around the area, making him become a bit alert. Soon he saw a large number of blue and red, black-colored giants running towards him. Tatsuya looked at the giants and said, now that's one hell of a stampede. Soon he saw a group of people flying in front of the giants. The group consisted of an old man with a long beard wearing a robe and a matching cap. The other person was a muscle man wearing Viking-like clothing with a hammer in his hand. Aside from the men, there were 3 women in their group as well, one with silver hair, one with black hair, and one with slightly purplish hair wearing different kinds of armors and weapons in their hands. Tatsuya thought that the group must be someone important as they were being chased by a huge army and decided to hear their talk. Why the hell are we running from them instead of fighting them? You idiot of a son, do you think that our fight will not cause damage to all the people living here? It is great that my assistant used sleep magic on all the whole area to make them all unconscious. I told you to not go out like this. We might get attacked. Us guardians never fear to get attacked, and this was for a liquor that even the crow found great. How can I miss the opportunity to not taste it? Yeah, then let's beat all of them and then go and have that booze. Men and their antics. Yeah, I feel ashamed that the old man is the leader of the Norse mythology. Hey, if you want to complain so much, then why the hell did you both came with me? Of course to taste that alcohol, but who the hell told you to travel through frost giants and Surtur's territory? Whatever, let's defeat them already. This place is wide enough to at least make the damage minimal. Soon all of them stopped, and then the muscular man came forward and said, come on and bring your hot and cold asses here. I will kick them all. Then the black-haired woman sighed and said, you cannot defeat the whole army, and even if you are able to, you will make a lot of destruction. Then the purplish-haired woman said, yeah, you cannot beat them. But I can. A voice was heard making all the giants and the group of people surprised. Chapter 103, the territory is mine. The sudden voice which was heard by all them made them surprised, and all of them turned their heads in the direction of the voice. What welcomed their sight was a man with black hair with his hands in his pockets, looking uninterested in what all was happening in front of him. Seeing the man standing in front of them, the frost giants and the fire demon started laughing and said, see, a puny human has come to destroy us. Athahaha. Tatsuya ignored their comments and started walking towards the giants. Seeing the man walking towards the giants, the muscle man came forward and said, young man, I appreciate your courage, but please stand back. We will try to hold them back. Tatsuya looked at the muscle man and said, you have some nerve to order me while you are in my territory. Hearing that, all of them were shocked, and then the old man said, don't speak nonsense. The one who governed this town are the devil girls, one with small boobs and the other with humongous boobs, and you doesn't match the description of any of those. All of them looked at the old man with a weird expression, and then the lady with black hair said, that's some nice way to remember someone. Pervert. Tatsuya looked at the old man and said, yes, I know that they are the one who administers the town, or those two, but you see, one of them is my girlfriend, so this town is technically mine as well. In fact, the ruler of the whole Shinto territory is my girlfriend too. Hearing that, all of them were shocked, and the old man pointed his finger at Tatsuya and said, don't lie to me, brat. There is no way that the sexy hot milfs Amaterasu and Yusaka are in a relationship with you. Tatsuya had some tick marks on his forehead, and he then used his psychic powers to squeeze the old man's balls with some strength. And the old man crouched down on the ground holding his balls while screaming in pain. Tatsuya then said, you have some guts to say that about my girlfriends in front of any, you bastard. The frost giants and the fire demons who were being ignored by them were getting impatient, and finally, of being able to bear it more, one of the frost giants said, stop ignoring us, you shit, and punched towards Tatsuya. All the people got worried, except for Odin, as he was in pain on seeing the frost giant attack the young boy. The muscular man gritted his teeth and said, you coward, you dare attack a human, try someone warehouse. OC. In. G.I. V. You, a fi, t. Just as he finished saying those words, the frost giant was slashed in half. All the people present there got shocked by the scene in front of them. Like I said, you guys have a lot of guts to attack me in my territory after coming without permission. All of them looked towards Tatsuya and saw his body radiating his aura while he was holding two huge axes in his hands. Tatsuya looked at both the groups of demons and the group which looked like humans and said in a cold voice, "If you surrender now, you live, make a wrong move, you die. Choose now." His voice made all of them suck in their breath, but then the frost giants and fire demons leaders said, "Like hell we will surrender to a human like you." Tatsuya just sighed and said, "Why do all guys like you appear in this town?" He then turned serious and said, "Anyways you decided, Todi then. Rita, Stormbreaker," and raised his axes in the air. Soon red lightning started to gather around Tatsuya, making even the Muskland took a step back on seeing the power of those lightning bolts. Seeing that even the muscle man took a step back, his whole group were shocked beyond belief. The silver-haired girl then said, "Did Thor-sama really take a step back after seeing those lightning bolts?" The other people who had their mouth open wide suddenly came out of their stupor, and then the black-haired lady said, "No, we are not seeing thing." That muscle brain really retreated after seeing that lightning. Then the purple-haired lady said, "It seems like we are in deep shit now. If that man take us for an enemy, we are done for." "Hey perv, why did you have to say something pervy about his girlfriend? If we die, it will all be your fault, Odin." The old man or Odin looked at the ladies and said, "Hey, it wasn't my fault that I got surprised after hearing him claiming that those MILFs are his girlfriend." Odin then suddenly had an idea and said, "Hey, why don't you three try to seduce him? If the situation gets dire, we can have a chance to survive because I can feel that he can kill me without any problem." All the girls looked at him with a weird expression but then looked at Tatsuya, and then the one who had slightly purplish hair said, "I don't mind, he is both strong and handsome." The other two looked at her, and the black-haired lady sighed and said, "I can agree on that, but you sure never change Freya. Already eyes on a strong person even without knowing anything about him." The silver-haired lady who was standing beside Odin said, "How can you accept something like this so easily, Freya-sama? Hela-sama, you will have to marry him, are you sure about that?" The black-haired lady Hela looked at the silver-haired woman and said, "It is because of your this attitude that you still didn't find a boyfriend for yourself, Roseweiss. You are too serious." The one named Roseweiss got shocked and crouched down on the floor and started crying and said, "Hey, it's not my fault. I want a boyfriend as well." "You Aya." Odin looked at her and said, "Then my virgin assistant, it is your chance now to get one for yourself. He is both handsome and strong, and seeing that he is this strong, he must be quite successful as well." Roseweiss then looked at Tatsuya and stopped crying and said, "What you said is true, but the fact that he already have girlfriends is the issue. I don't want a womanizers like him." Hearing her, Odin said, "Our likes are at stakes here, and you are thinking about your ideals. Because of this, you are still single." Roseweiss, who heard that again, crouched down and started crying. Tatsuya, who was charged his attack in both Rita and Stormbreaker, held both the axes just above his head and started to combine their powers, and once he was done, he swung his axes and said, "Solar Storm." And then very hot bolts of lightning started to fall on the frost giants and fire demons, which even disintegrated their bodies, not even leaving a trace of their bodies. Within a blink of an eye, the whole army of giants which were standing in front of them were completely obliterated, which made Odin sure that the young man in front of him could kill all of them in an instant. Tatsuya then glared back at Odin's group and asked, "So do you want to surrender or?" "We surrender," and all of them raised their hands showing that they really surrendered. Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Good." Chapter 104. Extortion. Tatsuya looked at all of them once more, and after confirming that they were not planning anything shady, he made his axes disappear. Tatsuya then used his magic to bind all of them and said, "Now quickly answer me. Who are you, and what is your business in this town?" The group who was bound by Tatsuya were a bit angry, as all of them were gods in their mythology, except Roseweiss, and him treating them so casually was something that none even dared to do. Still, all of them contained their anger, and then Old Man said, "Well, we are from the Asgard, and I am Odin, the godfather of Asgard, and I would like to apologize for all the trouble we have caused to you. Those frost giants and fire demons came after us after confirming that I will be out of Asgard for a while and came to kill me." Tatsuya stared at him for a while, which made them think whether he was observing them to know whether they were lying or not. What Tatsuya was actually doing was using his telepathy to know the truth, and after learning the truth, he looked at Odin and the others with a weird look on his face and said, "Don't tell me you are the pervert that Azazel mentioned about earlier and asked me to make arrangements?" Hearing that, all of them were shocked. They didn't even expect it that the person they came to meet was standing in front of them. Odin immediately nodded his head and said, "Yes, that crow told me that he has made a reservation under his own name." Tatsuya then narrowed his eyes and said, "But aren't you quite late for dinner, and you even brought an army with you? How can I believe that you didn't came to attack the town?" And started releasing his aura, making all them having trouble to breathe and crouch down on the ground. Odin then somehow managed to look at Tatsuya and said, "I swear on my divinity and my title as the godfather of Asgard that I didn't have any intentions of war. I only came to have a taste of that liquor and visit some strip clubs." Tatsuya and the others were dumbfounded by his answer, and Tatsuya then undid their restraints and then said, "You really are a pervert. Anyway, you guys clean the mess that you have created all over the town first, and why the hell is that lady over there breathing so heavily?" Everyone looked towards the purple-haired lady and saw her having a flushed face and breathing heavily. Hela looked back at Tatsuya and said, "Don't worry, she is just having some lewd thoughts about you." Tatsuya looked back at her and said, "Are all the gods in Asgard perverts?" Hela then smirked and said, "Well, technically our realm is called Asgard." Tatsuya, who heard that, was speechless and just looked at her with a deadpan expression. The muscle mini seemed to have gotten a bit angry and said, "Hey, don't badmouth Asgard, you mortal." Tatsuya looked at him and said, "She was the one who said that, so tell her that, not me. And what are you all waiting for? Get to cleaning the mess immediately. We don't have all day." Odin nodded and then looked at the silver-haired lady and said, Rose-wise if you may. The silver-haired lady nodded and said, yes Odin-sama, and then a lot of magic circles started to appear all over the sky and started to restore all the damaged areas. Tatsuya looked at the magic circles and widened his eyes and said, though you may not be strong, your control over magic is great. I have never seen someone able to control these many magic circles at once. The lady who suddenly heard the praise looked at Tatsuya and said, really do you think this is great? But I am so happy no one has praised me for my ability to since the time I became a Valkyrie. Odin-sama, did you hear that? Odin looked at Rosewise and said, yes I heard that, now get back to work. And Rosewise immediately started working again, but this time she had a smile on her face. Tatsuya then looked at them and asked, now what will you be doing now? Odin looked at him and said, what? Like I told you we came for the liquor, so definitely we will be going to drink. Tatsuya looked at him and asked, what time do you think it is that the shop will be open? Suddenly realization hit him and he then said, hey young man, won't you let me have the drink to this old man? I traveled a very long distance to get that drink. Tatsuya looked at him for a while and then said, I will be charging 5 times the usual rate for inconveniencing me. Odin shouted, that's straight up extortion. Tatsuya calmly said, deal with it or go back. Odin kept gritted his teeth and finally said, fine, but make sure that you give your best stuff. Tatsuya smirked and said, don't worry about the quality, just think whether you will be able to handle it or not. Odin and Thor smirked, don't challenge an Asgardian when it comes to drinking. Tatsuya nodded and said, good, well let me introduce myself, I am Tatsuya Shiba, nice to meet you. All of them nodded and said, let me introduce us as well. Like I said before, I am Odin, and this here is my son Thor. Hey there, I am Hela, and this person who was Havi G. Lude thoughts just a moment ago is. Hello, my name is Freya. If you ever need to release some stress, make sure to come to me. You will feel that you are in heaven. The silver-haired lady who seemed to have finished her work and said, I am Rosewise, assistant of Odin-sama. It's a pleasure to meet you. Tatsuya nodded and then brought all of them to his restaurant and started working on their order. Chapter 105, Party. After that, the whole group of Odin decided to have the same drink, and to Tatsuya's surprise, the one who was able to last the longest was Rosewise, who though was conscious but did the most embarrassing things while she was drunk. She even proposed Tatsuya after Tatsuya comforted her when she told her horrible working conditions with Odin. Tatsuya also recorded the whole thing that she did after being drunk and decided to use it to tease her in future. Underworld, the Gremry territory. Currently the whole Gremry mansion is in an uproar and is being decorated for the celebration of Rias's first win in the raiding game. And despite a lot of them were happy for her, there was one person who was not happy with the current situation. In one of the rooms of the Gremly mansion, one could see that the whole room is filled with rubble consisting of broken furniture, showpiece, bottles, etc., and a man wearing white clothes with red hair could be seen sitting in one corner of the room. This person is none other than the current head of the Gremry family, Zeotifuck Zeoticus Gremry. Zeoticus, who has kept his eyes closed, massaged his temple and said, how the hell did all this happen? I did make sure that there were no problems with this marriage and then decided to let her participate in that raiding game to only look like a good father. I thought that an amateur will not be able to defeat a seasoned player and a phoenix at that. I underestimated her. No, I underestimated her peerage. I didn't know that they were so strong, and the Red Dragon Emperor is in her peerage. All this were not in my equation. Now all my plans to make a direct connection with the phoenix is completely ruined. He then punched the wall beside him, causing a crack in the wall. He then sighed and said, well, what's done is done. That daughter of mine is now out of her marriage that she wanted from so long. Let's congratulate her later as a good father. I should now make plans for what to do now. Well, let's see, many devil families will still be willing to marry her. Let's try to set her up with some high-class devil family as a reward for her performance in the raiding game. I'm sure many of the influential devil houses will like to be a part of the Gremry family. I just need to see which house will benefit us the most. He then showed a malicious smile, but it immediately changed to a normal one, and then he left the room. Time skip. Later that day in the evening, a lot of people dressed in formal clothing could be seen inside the Gremly mansion. Surzex, who was watching all of them from the side and had a smile and thought, all these people came here just to butter up the Gremly house. And after knowing that Ryatan's engagement will be broken tonight, many of the young devils are now aiming for her. Seriously, these horny males, don't they know that Ryatan promised to marry her Onii-chan when she was young? All this thinking is making me frustrated. He then took out the pendant he was wearing and opened it, and the pendant revealed a photo of a woman in it. Surzex started at the picture for a while and a small smile appeared on his face. He then thought, Iris would have surely scolded me for having all these unnecessary thoughts and would ask me to do my duties diligently if I had time to think all that. He then kept on looking for a while when suddenly he felt someone tugging his robe. He closed the pendant and looked at the one who tugging his robe and smiled. What happened? Feeling bored, Millikas? Millikas nodded his head and then said, let's go, father. I am getting bored. Surzex smiled and held his hand and said, then let's go and find what your grandmother and my sister is doing. And both of them left the room. In another room of Gremry Mansion, Rias and her peerage along with Venelana were in the room dressed up and were waiting for the event to begin. Rias, who was sitting on the sofa, stretched her hands and said, finally, I am finally free from this forced marriage. Now I don't have to marry him. Her peerage looked at her and all thought, she sure is very happy even after the game ended like that. Then Alana looked at her daughter and said, don't be too happy yet. After your engagement is officially annulled, there would be a ton of devil houses who would like to marry you, and if your father finds someone suitable, then you could be soon engaged again. Hearing that, Rias's expression changed, and she looked at her mother and said, Mom, don't think negatively about such matter. And even if I am engaged again, I will get out of it just like I did with this engagement. Then Alana shook her head and said, This time, I don't think that you will get a chance to fight a rating game. You only got a chance this time because the engagement was made before you were even born, and now you who is mature enough will have to take the engagement seriously as the heiresses of the Grimmery house. Even though I am still against all this, I cannot stop your father if he takes a decision like he did with Riser. Rias, who heard her mother, was shocked and didn't know what to do. She then said, then what if I say to them that I have a boyfriend? Will they still be able to make me go through all this again? At this, everyone in the room perked up and Venelana asked, there is a chance that you will not be made to go through all that again, but that depends on the status of your boyfriend. Rias, who heard that, puffed her chest and said, there is no problem with that. I will tell that Tatsuya is my boyfriend. No one will dare to question his status. After all, even Oni-sama thinks highly of him. Everyone in the room got surprised at her announcement and were left speechless. But suddenly the door of the room opened and revealed Surzex and Milikas. Surzex then looked at them and said, I heard what you all were talking about, and in my opinion this idea will not work for 2 reasons. 1. Even though I think highly of him, and he indeed lives up to my respect, he is but still a human, and no matter what, devils will never think highly of him. 2. Tatsuya himself will deny of you being her girlfriend if he is asked whether you tack her in a relationship or not. He don't like troublesome things at all. Sudden 2 people came from the door and everyone looked at them and saw Sona and Tsubaki standing there. Sona then shifted her glasses and said, 3. There is also the fact that you have to convince his whole harem about your relationship, which is actually a very difficult task, and I am saying this from experience. Tsubaki looked at Sona and thought, only if they knew his actual thoughts this idea would not have even came to their minds. Well, whatever, it's not my problem. I am in a relationship with him, and that's only matter to me. Whether she marries some old fart or a newborn is her problem. Isami also nodded her head on Sona's comment and said, what President is saying is true, even I am not yet accepted by all of them. Rias, who heard, looked at them and said, don't worry, he will fall for my charm easily. At this, everyone in the room looked at her with a deadpan expression and thought, how much overconfident can she be? Milikas looked at Rias and thought, even I know that Rias Oni-sama is not Tatsuya and I's type. Kiba looked at his king and thought, if either Tatsuya or I were people who get in relationship with a girl just by her looks, then the whole school would be under our control. Grafia then came to the room and then said, the members of the Phoenix family have arrived. Surzex-sama, Rias-sama, Venelana-sama, master has asked for your presence. All of them nodded and Rias looked at Akino and said, let's go, Akino. Akino nodded and started following them. Soon the Grimmeries along with Akino and Grafia reached the room and saw a blonde man and woman standing along with Zeoticus. All of them approached them and bowed a butt, and Surzex said with a bow, I hope that you are doing well, Lord and Lady Phoenix. We are doing fine. Thanks for asking, Surzex-sama. Venelana then looked at Jessica, Lady Phoenix, and did a curt nod, which she returned as well. Zeoticus then said, well, they have come to annul the marriage contract between Rias and Riser. Rias then looked around the room and asked, Riser is not here? Lord Phoenix looked at her and said, no, my son didn't come here. He had some matters to attend to. But don't worry, he have already signed the required documents. Rias nodded and thought, he must be too ashamed to face the others, and smiled a little. Meanwhile, at Riser's location, Riser cannot believe that Riser lost to someone who have never participated in a rating game. Suddenly he felt someone place a hand on his shoulder, and then he heard a voice, now, the mourning period is over. Grab a drink and let's celebrate. Riser nodded and held a glass of wine and said, to the annulment of Riser's marriage. To the annulment of your marriage. And everyone in the room took a sip of their drinks. Riser then looked at the person who placed his hand on him and said, Riser would like to thank you all to come to Riser's small party. Tatsuya-san, Sarorg-san, Agar-san. All 3 of them nodded their heads and Tatsuya said, no problem, you are holding a party at my place. It only benefits me, and I called these 2 as well, or it would have been boring. Sarorg then looked at Riser and said, it should be me who should thank you for inviting me, though I am surprised that you are not grieving on your loss and annulment of your marriage. Didn't you want to marry my cousin Rias very badly? Riser snorted and said, who would be happy to be bound in a marriage contract with someone they don't even know? Riser was only pushing her to marry me because it was Riser's duty as a member of Phoenix family. Even though Riser is not an heir, Riser still takes his duty seriously. And what should Riser grieve about? It only benefits Riser. Riser can go back to live his life peaceful, not studying about how to lead the house Riser would be marrying to. Riser is completely free from all that. Sikvera then looked at him and asked, but don't you feel bad? You could have become the head of House of Grimmery in future. You would have gained a lot of wealth and authority. Riser waved his hand and said, too troublesome. Riser is earning enough from both his business and the rating games and can easily support Riser's harem, and that's all Riser cares about. Having more authority will only increase Riser's work. Riser wants to live freely, not with these troublesome things. Sarorg, who heard that, sighed and said, I can't understand that both you and Tatsuya have power, but both of you don't want any authority and only wants to fool around. Both Tatsuya and Riser looked at Sarorg and said simultaneously, hey, what is wrong with living a life like that? Instead of getting involved with all that shit, Riser thinks Riser's way is better, and both of them fist bumped. Tatsuya then looked at Sarorg and Sikvera and asked, anyway, is it really fine for both of you to be here and not attend the Grimmery's party? Especially you, Sarorg, after all, she is your cousin. Both of them shook their heads and Sikvera said, I have no problem. I have told my parents that me and my peerage are going to exterminate some Rouges on the request of the Archduke. Sarorg then said, no problems with me either. I have told mother that me and my peerage have some work to do. Besides, didn't I promise earlier you have much more priority in my eyes than the devils? How could I refuse when you were the one who invited me? Tatsuya smiled in Sarorg's answer and said, then let's drink tonight till we are wasted on the celebration of annulment of Riser's engagement. Riser looked at Tatsuya and said, you took the words out of Riser's mouth, Tatsuya-san. Sarorg looked at Tatsuya and said, Oi, are you even allowed to drink alcohol? Tatsuya looked at Sarorg and said, Sarorg, let's compete who can drink more. When Sarorg heard the word compete, he forgot all about age restrictions and started gulping down the bottle in front of him, and so did all the boys of his peerage. The girls looked at the boys and said, seriously, these boys and their antics, and rest of the girls nodded their heads in approval. Underworld, in Gremory's mansion. All the documents concerning Rias's marriage annulment were signed, and all of them were in the hall attending the party. Then Alana, Misla, and Jessica were standing with each other and were talking when suddenly Vinalana asked, hey, why I don't see your children and their peerages here. Now that I think about it, Seek Verichan is also not present. Misla looked at Vinalana and said, Sarorg said that he had somewhere to go and would not be able to come. Jessica said, Riser said the same thing as well, but what I am surprised about is that Ravel was also very excited to go with him. Suddenly all three of them realized something and said, all three of them are absent, don't tell me they all are where I think. Misla then formed magic circle and called Keisha. Suddenly a small projection of Keisha appeared in Misla's hand. Keisha looked at Misla and the other two and bowed her head and asked, is there some problem, Misla-sama? Misla shook her head and said, nothing like that. I wanted to ask you where you guys currently at. At this, Keisha's body became stiff and she averted her eyes and was about to make an excuse when suddenly, hey, who gave alcohol to Miyuki? She is drunk now. Hey Miyuki, don't tear my clothes. Oni-sama, let's make kittens. Why the hell are you talking like Kuroka? Kaya, Tatsuya-sama, cover yourself first. You fool, take as many pictures as possible. It is a very rare and magnificent sight. Riser cannot believe it. How big are you, Tatsuya-san? I cannot win against you in this no matter how much I train. Don't worry, Sarorg-sama, you are not the only one. We know how you feel. Hey Seek-chan, send those photos to me as well. Misla then ended the call and looked at the other ladies, and of them nodded at each other. Then Alana then said, Grafia, we are going somewhere, don't forget to take a camera. Grafia then said, don't worry, Vinalana-sama, I have already prepared all the things we will be needing for our trip. And all four of them teleported somewhere. Chapter 106, Party 2. Right when the whole chaos was going on, the door of the room opened and the Norse mythology group came. Odin, whose eyes were closed, waved his hand, said, thanks a lot, young man, I couldn't believe that I passed out for a whole day because of alcohol. He then opened his eyes, and just when he opened his eyes, they widened in shock. He then rubbed his eyes as if thinking that what he was seeing was not real. He then looked at Thor and said, will you pinch me? Thor shrugged his shoulder and did as he was told. Ouch. Odin then rubbed the spot where he was pinched and then said with a huge smile on his face, this is real. I cannot believe this. Lolis, twins from Riser's peerage, Ape Loli, Ravel, Big Tit One Esams, MILFs, cat-eared ladies. Fuck Asgard, this is the true paradise for me. Now we just need a maid and the whole collection will be complete. Just as he said that, a magic circle appeared in the room and Vinalana and the others appeared in the room. Odin looked at Grafia and then said, now I must have used all the good luck I posses. I can finally die in peace. Suddenly a hand was placed on his shoulder and he heard a voice. Oh, I will be more than happy to kill you right now, you old bastard. Odin turned his head and saw Hela looking at him with a smile on her face, but the aura that she was releasing was saying something entirely different. Odin gulped and said, well, let's have a drink and then leave. Che, damn heck. Suddenly Hela's grip tightened and she said, you thought of something rude, didn't you? Odin started to sweat a bit and he said, WW, whatever you mean? Hela smiled and said, you are dead, and punched him on the face, sending him flying away and crashing into the wall. Hela then sighed and looked around the room to see what was happening and saw that everyone was looking at them intently. She ignored their gazes, but suddenly she stopped looking around and started to look intently at something. She didn't move her gaze away and asked, hey Freya, are you also looking at that? Freya, who had a flushed face, said, what else is there to look in this room besides that? That is too big for a man of his stature. Everyone who heard their conversation followed their gazes where those two were looking, and the girls in the room immediately blushed, while the boys suddenly got depressed. Odin, who came out of the wall, looked around the room and was confused, and his gaze then fell on Thor, who was crouching in one corner while mumbling, his hammer is bigger than mine. Odin was well confused and then saw everyone looking at the same direction. He too looked that way and his eyes widened in shock. He too then sat beside Thor and started mumbling, his spear is longer than mine. Kurumi, who saw the condition of the people, smirked and said, even gods cannot compare Tatsuya. Tatsuya, who was now being started, it felt awkward and then covered his Excalibur with his hands. Click. Suddenly the sound was heard by all, and Tatsuya looked at the direction from where the sound came and saw Grafia holding a camera in her hand. Tatsuya looked at her for a while and asked, look, what are you doing? Nothing of your importance. Don't mind me and continue what you were doing earlier. She then paused for a while and then said, can you move your hands away? It's blocking the view. Tatsuya was dumbfounded by her answer and looked around the room and saw every girl in the room looking at her and thought, why are there so many Freyas in the room? He then snapped his finger and then he was again covered in clothes, making all the girls grunt in displeasure. He then looked at the Norse group and asked, you guys are still here? Hela then said, we decided to thank you for taking care of us after we were passed out. Freya then said, but I didn't thought of receiving such a treat on coming here. Tatsuya ignored her comment and then looked at Vinalana's group and asked, and why are you all here? Didn't you have to attend your daughter's celebration party? Vinalana looked at him and said, we did attend that, but when we came to know that there was an event going on here, we decided to come here instead. Tatsuya then asked, what kind of event did you think was going on here? Before any of them could answer, Kurumi said, what else? They must have thought that an orgy is going on here. At this, all the girls in the room except for the older ones blushed. Freya then looked around the room and said, seeing the condition of the other males and in what situation Tatsuya was, it would be more appropriate to call reverse rape. At this their blush intensified more, making them look like that they were about to faint. Kurumi then raised her hand and said, "Oh, to those of you who have not heard yet, there is an announcement that I have to make." At this most of ladies who were present there looked at her intently, while some of them who knew what she was going to do sighed or glared at her. Kurumi then gave a fake cough and said, "I have already claimed the throne." Most of the girls were confused on what Kurumi said. Seeing their confused expression, Kurumi made a circle with the fingers in one hand, and then started to use the middle finger of the other to make an action which looked like entering and leaving the soul sea, with a sly grin on her face. All the ladies now understood what she was saying and then began glaring at her as well. Tatsuya was sitting in one of the chairs without bothering about what they were talking about and was silent drinking. After the declaration was made by Kurumi, Miyuki came forward with a proud expression on her face along with Himari and said, "Kurumi, you are not the only one. We did that with Oni Isama-sama as well." Kurumi then smirked and said, "Yeah, I know, I was watching the whole thing from inside him. I have to say, you two lost pretty easily. Tatsuya and I had a wilder night than yours." Hearing that, Miyuki and Himari scowled and glared at Kurumi, and then all of them started bickering. Tatsuya then noticed someone approach him and looked at the person and asked, "What happened, Freya? Hella?" Both of them sat beside him and Freya said, "If you want, you can do it with us." Hella then said, "And if you agree now, you get a Rosewise free." Rosewise, who was standing behind them, said, "Hey, don't treat me like a freebie." Tatsuya then put his glass on the table and said, "Sorry, not interested." At his answer, all three of them were surprised as they could not believe to deny them even after Freya was using her seduction magic. Freya then said, "You know, not many people and a human at that would get a chance to have sex with a goddess, and two at that. You can still take up on the offer." Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Thanks for your concern, but my answer will not change. I am not a man who will do it someone that I don't love." At this, all three of them widened their eyes and said, "And what about that harem of yours?" Tatsuya then said, "Hey, I did say that not to those that I don't love. They all consist of people that I love, so they are fine." Rosewise looked at him and thought, even though he is womanizer, he is not bad. Looks like I thought very wrongly of him. Both Hella and Freya then sighed and then said, "Whatever, but do tell whenever you need some company in the bed." Suddenly they heard a cold voice which said, "Oni Isama have much more people to accompany him than his bed can even handle." This creeped both of them, and they jolted back in surprise. Tatsuya then looked at Miyuki and said, "Don't scare them like that," and patted her head. Miyuki, who was being patted, was in bliss and hummed in response. Tatsuya's hands were then grabbed by someone, and he looked at the people holding them and found Asia and Ingvild holding one each. He raised an eyebrow and then asked, "What do you two want?" Ingvild and Asia looked at each other and then nodded their heads and then said, "Please, let us accompany you in the night, the next time." Tatsuya didn't take much time and said, "Okay." Ingvild then said, "Please, wait, you already agreed." "How?" Tatsuya shrugged his shoulders and said, "Do you really believe that I think that any of you will stay silent after one of you did that? It only is a matter of time till you ask me yourself. So instead of postponing it, agreeing will be the correct way." Then as for after them, said Karen while pointing at the other three Nekishu around her, making them all blush. Tatsuya nodded and said, "Done." The other girls in the room also wanted to ask him, but decided to stop as they don't have any intimate relationship with him. But then suddenly Graphia raised her hand and said in her usual cold tone, "Then I want to turn as well." All the girls looked at Graphia with a surprised expression, except the Norse girls, and Venolana and the other two looked at her as if she was a traitor. Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then said, "Well, that was a little unexpected, but you have to take the permission of the others first." Graphia then said, "Understood. Now then, the ladies who are in a relationship with Tatsuya, please gather in an empty room immediately. We have some things to discuss as soon as possible," and then opened the door. All the girls looked at her with a deadpan expression before following her out of the room. After all of them were gone, Keisha came closer to Tatsuya and said shyly, "I want to do it as well." Tatsuya looked at her and said, "No problems, go and discuss with them." After Keisha left the room as well, there was silence filled in the room, and everyone was looking at Tatsuya. Tatsuya looked back at them and said, "What? If I don't agree with this, I am scared that I will become a rape victim." The people thought about what Tatsuya said for a while and then nodded their heads in understanding. They could imagine that it can happen in future. Underworld, Gremui Mansion. Sona, Sabaki and Serfal were feeling a bit odd and thought, "Why do I feel like that I am missing something important?" Chapter 107, A Crow in Town. In the morning, Tatsuya is standing in front of the open door of his house with a red head standing just in front of him. Tatsuya looked at her for a while and asked, "What happened, Rias? Why so early in the morning? Need something?" Ria shook her head and said, "Nope, just wanted to VO to school along with you." Tatsuya nodded and looked back inside and said, "Girls, Grimory will be joining us on the way to school." "Whatever, it doesn't matter," all of them said in unison. Tatsuya shrugged his shoulders and then said, "Wait for a bit, and then we will leave." Soon all of them came and Tatsuya and the others left for the school. Along the way, Sinan looked at Rias and asked, "So how's your life after winning the game? We heard that you had a celebration on your win. Rias looked at her and smiled. "It has been good. No more fussing over engagement or being forced by the family. And yeah, we did celebrate. But you know, there have been a lot of people who are trying to set up a marriage with me. Seriously, it's so annoying. I even told them that I am interested in somebody else, but they are still not giving up." Rias said those words while glancing at Tatsuya, who did what any sane man would do. Simply ignored her and kept on walking. All the girls looked at her and were trying to hold their laugh, and all of them thought, does she really think that she could make him jealous? Seriously, Redhead has too much overconfidence. Tatsuya, who was simply walking, and then suddenly someone jumped on his back. Tatsuya turned his head and said, "Good morning, Isami. Looks like you're enthusiastic in the morning." Isami just smiled and gave him a peck on the lips. During these few days after the devils came back, Isami's and Tatsuya's got into relationship after Isami confessed to him. Though she thought that she would be rejected by others, but to her surprise even Miyuki allowed her to be with Tatsuya rather easily. Tatsuya himself didn't have any problem with that as he had taken a liking to Isami during the time she used to train under him. He was quite happy himself as he was going to confess to her himself after the raiding game was over. Isami then got off from Tatsuya's back and then looked at others and said, "Good morning everyone." Her gaze then fell on Rias and she asked, "What are you doing here, Press?" Rias just smiled and said, "Oh, just joining them on the way to school." Ingvild then came closer to Isami and said, trying to seduce Tatsuya. Isami, who now heard the real reason, nodded and then started to talk with the girls. Rias then walked closer to Tatsuya and asked, "Hey Tatsuya, can we have the ORC meeting at your house today?" Tatsuya didn't even look at her and said, "Why?" This answer made her a bit surprised and she said, "Please, the clubhouse will be undergoing the annual cleaning." Tatsuya then thought for a while and then said, "Then it would be better to go to Isami's house. She can meet her parents as well like that." Rias, who heard that, wanted to retort but couldn't as Tatsuya's reasoning was right. Soon all of them reached the school and separated their ways. Later that day, Tatsuya and his group went directly to their homes without bothering the Grimmery group. On the way, Ingvild looked asked, "Why didn't you let them come to the house? You are not that strict to let someone not even enter it." Tatsuya looked at her and then said, "I don't have any problems if a person just wants to come and hang out. What I have a problem with is that if she found out about our training facilities, she would be bothering us too much. Do you think that a time chamber is something easily available? The gravity and climate manipulators along with all the things present there to make you all train for different circumstances is not something that can be easily found." All of them nodded and then silently went back home. At night, Tatsuya felt a familiar presence inside the town and decided to check. He then directly teleported to the location and found himself standing in a room with a lot of sofas and dim lighting. He then took a seat on the sofa and waited for a while, and soon a door opened and came a man with black and blonde hair wearing a yukata. Tatsuya looked at the man and asked calmly, "What are you doing here in the town, Azazel?" Azazel was surprised by the voice and looked at Tatsuya and asked, "Since when did you came here?" "A while ago." Azazel nodded and then took a seat on one of the sofas and said, "Well, this town is peaceful and I like the silence here. It's very relaxing." Tatsuya looked at him with a deadpan expression and said, "And what is the real reason?" Azazel smirked and asked, "Whatever you mean, I am just a friendly neighborhood fallen angel." Tatsuya snorted and said, "More like a friendly neighborhood pervert, and answer me seriously. Why are you here?" Azazel's face twitched and he said, "Hey man, don't be like that. I just came here for some research." As he said that, a magic circle appeared in the room and soon Isami came out of it. "Are you the one who summoned a devil?" Isami then looked at the people sitting in the room and found Tatsuya along with Azazel in the room. Her eyes widened in surprise on seeing Tatsuya and she asked, "Tatsuya, are you the one who summoned me here?" Tatsuya simply glanced at Azazel in response to her question. Azazel looked at the two of them and said, "Wait, you two know each other?" Both Tatsuya and Isami nodded in response, and then Tatsuya said, "So what request do you have from my girlfriend?" and gave a cold smile. Azazel, who looked at Tatsuya, got a shiver run down his spine and said, "Nothing like that. I just wanted someone to accompany me while drinking." Tatsuya just nodded his head and then said, "And what about your research?" Azazel then said, "Oh, I heard that the wilder of the boosted gear is in this town, so I decided to check on her and try to take her under my wing." He then glanced at Isami, who was still confused, and said, "But seeing that she is already a devil and your girlfriend as well, I guess that I already missed the opportunity." Tatsuya looked at Azazel and said, "Well, it was a fallen angel who killed her, so I guess you already lost the chance to even ask her." Azazel, who heard that, looked at Tatsuya and said, "Seriously, man, there has been a lot of rouges and traitors in the organization. This getting on my nerves. It is because of them that fallen angels have a bad name in the supernatural world." Tatsuya then sat back comfortably and then said, "Anyway, let's leave it at that. How far has your research progressed and how is the battle junkie?" Azazel then summoned a bottle of whiskey and some glasses and poured him and Tatsuya some. He then looked at Isami and asked, "Do you drink?" Isami, who just being ignored till now, got surprised and said, "No, I don't." Tatsuya then took out a can of cola and threw it at her and said, "Here." Isami caught the can and then looked at both of them and asked, "Is it fine for me being here?" Tatsuya waved his hands and said, "Just sit there for a while and drink. After that your contract is complete and you can go." Isami nodded and then opened the can. Tatsuya and Azazel then started their talk, and after talking for a while, Azazel then asked, "Hey, what would you do about Vala? Because you must be knowing that there is no way that he will not fight that girl sitting there." Tatsuya took a big sip and then said, "I don't mind as long as they are fighting, but if the situation comes to Isami getting killed, then I will interfere. Besides, if I just promise him that I will fight in her stead, then he will easily expect." Tatsuya then had a smirk and then said, "I also know some of his dark secrets, so he would be willing to accept my offer happily." Azazel looked at Tatsuya and said, "Hey, I hardly believe that a battle junkie like him will yield to a threat like that." Tatsuya smiled and said, "Oh, he will be more than willing to. After all, it would better for him that others do not know that he have but fetish." Tatsuya then looked at the clock and said, "Well, it has become very late. I guess we should get going." Tatsuya then looked at Azazel and said, "Now pay up for the contract." Azazel twitched his lips and said, "How stingy can you be?" Tatsuya then said, "Hey, I am not revealing that the governor of the Grigori is in the town to the devils. It should be plenty enough." He then looked at Isami and then said, "And make sure to not tell the others about this pervert." Isami only nodded and said, "It doesn't matter. Seeing that he is on good terms with you, I can be assured that he don't have any ill intentions." Azazel then stopped grumbling and then pointed to a painting and said, "How about this as a compensation? It is an original." Isami looked at Azazel and said, "I am fine with that, but isn't that too expensive?" Azazel shrugged his shoulders and said, this is the only thing that I have at the moment. Tatsuya snorted and said, like hell the leader of a faction is short on money. Azazel's brows twitched and he said, anyway this is all I have, the only other thing that I can give you is my soul. Isami then waved her hands and said, no, I didn't do anything to get your soul as compensation. Tatsuya then moved towards Azazel and said, sure why not, and removed the astral body from his human body Seiki's power, and immediately Azazel's body blanked out. Azazel who was in his astral form looked at his body and said, did you really extract my soul? Tatsuya looked at him with a neutral expression and said, yeah. He then looked at his own astral body and saw that he could see through it. He then tried to grab Tatsuya but was unable to. His eyes then fell on Isami who was trying to wake his flesh body up and said, well girl, can't you see me? Tatsuya looked at him, no one can see you or hear you if you are in that form. Azazel was surprised by that and then started thinking something and said, then can I stay in the ladies' bath without getting caught? He then looked at Tatsuya and said, Tatsuya let's go to a bathhouse right now. Tatsuya looked at him with a deadpan expression and after signing said, I cannot believe that you can think something good out of this. Azazel grinned and then said, I always look at the positive aspects of everything. No, you look at the perverted aspects of everything. Azazel shrugged his shoulder and said, that comes in positive aspect as well. Tatsuya then sighed and then combined his astral and flesh body and took Isami along with him. See you later and don't cause trouble, and left his apartment along with Isami. Chapter 108, Brothers. After both Isami and Tatsuya left Azazel's place, Isami started asking questions about Azazel and Tatsuya started to explain her about the fallen angels and Grigori. Soon Isami got a call from Rias regarding a stray devil in the town and Isami and Tatsuya parted ways. Tatsuya, who was now alone, decided to take a long way home as he wanted to travel a bit after drinking with Azazel and started walking aimlessly around the town. After half an hour of walking it started to rain, but Tatsuya used his psychic powers to make the water droplets bounce of his body. Seeing that it was raining heavily, Tatsuya decided to go home as others might get worried. On his way, he heard a voice which he concluded to be clash between swords and decided to check the area using magic. But just as he used it, he confirmed it to be Kiba and ran towards the location. Just as he reached there, he saw Kiba and a stray priest which he thought to be Freed were fighting. He then came forward and asked, what's going on here? Both Kiba and Freed got alert by the voice and looked at Tatsuya. Kiba widened his eyes and said, Tatsuya, what are you doing here? Just taking a stroll. Didn't expect to fight you here. So who is that guy, your friend? Kiba shook his head and said, no, this person standing here is Freed Selzen, a Rouge priest. Tatsuya looked at Freed and said, nice to meet you. Tatsuya, Shiba at your service. Freed looked at Tatsuya weirdly for a while and then said, hello, I guess. Freed was then suddenly hit by realization, and he pointed his sword at Tatsuya and said, hey, it is not the time to introduce ourselves. What are you doing here? You know what, just leave it. I will just slice you apart as well. Tatsuya looked at Freed and asked, what happened, man? Why so angry? Someone stepped on your dick, or what? Freed gritted his teeth and then said, forget it, you will die first. Tatsuya then looked at Kiba and asked, you cut his dick, or what? Kiba shrugged and said, no, he is just like that. Tatsuya nodded and then asked, want me to deal with him? Kiba then gripped his sword tightly and said, no, I request you to not interfere. There are some debts that I have to clear with that sword. Tatsuya then looked at the sword in Freed's hands and said, oh, it's one of those Excalibur pieces, huh? Well, go ahead, be my guest. Kiba nodded and said, thanks. Freed, who heard them, laughed maniacally and said, what happened, shithead? Got scared of my Excalibur-chan. Tatsuya then looked at Freed and said, I have an Excalibur down there as well, and you know, girls love it. Freed became a big pissed on seeing that Tatsuya wasn't the slightest bit scared and then said, let's stop talking and start slashing. Kiba became serious and said, yeah, let's go. Holy Eraser, and black beams started to originate from Kiba's sword and attack Freed. Freed simply blocked the attack with his sword and then the sword started to emit holy aura. Freed then looked at Kiba and said, that will not work on my Excalibur-chan, Devil-kun. Kiba gritted his teeth and then ran towards Freed and started slashing at Freed. Freed continued to laugh maniacally and then parried all of Kiba's slashes. Tatsuya observed their fight and thought, that sword must be Excalibur rapidly. That must be the reason why Freed is able to fight at Kiba's speed. They kept on fighting for a while with none gaining advantage over the other. Both of them were pretty tired, but suddenly Freed found an opening and slashed Kiba on the arm. Kiba then took a step back and groaned in pain. Freed then licked his lips and said, stings a lot, right, Devil-kun? Oh, I feel so great. Tatsuya looked at Freed and said, why, someone penetrated you from behind, or what? Hearing that, Freed got out of his own world and glared at Tatsuya and said, just you wait, shithead. I will deal with you once I kill Devil-kun, and started running towards Kiba. Kiba, who was injured, decided to block the attack, but noticed that he won't be on time because of his injury. Just as Freed was about to attack Kiba, Tatsuya said, oh man, you stepped on dog shit. Yuck. Freed immediately stopped his hand and looked down and lifted his foot. Tatsuya saw that and said, Kiba now. Kiba nodded and slashed at Freed. Freed, who noticed the attack coming towards him, jumped away and then said, hey, that's not fair. Tatsuya just looked at him without any expression and said, yeah, I know. Freed then said, it's a 2 against 1. Tatsuya with the same expressionless face said, and so is a threesome. But they don't complain, do they? Both Freed's and Kiba's lips twitched and Freed said, this example is irrelevant here. Tatsuya nodded his head and said, I know. Freed gritted his teeth and again took his stance to fight, but suddenly a magic circle appeared near his ear and Freed's eyes widened. He then looked at Tatsuya and Kiba and said, looks like you live a bit longer, Devil-kun, shithead. Someone is calling me. and then threw something on the ground, and the whole area illuminated in a blinding light. Fried put his sword on his waist and ran away, but what he failed to notice was that Tatsuya already taking his sword and storing it in his storage. Tatsuya then came back to his position before the light died down. He then looked at Kiba and said, "Well, there he goes, so want to tell me your story?" Kiba sighed and then said, "Let's find a shelter first. It is raining quite heavily." Tatsuya nodded and both of them then entered an apartment which seemed to be Kiba's house. Tatsuya has already informed the others that he would be staying at Kiba's place for the night as he had something to discuss with him. Kiba and Tatsuya then dried themselves up and then sat down facing each other. Tatsuya looked at Kiba and Kiba was looking down on the floor. Tatsuya waited for him to speak, but noticing him he sighed and said, "Listen, I am not forcing you to speak up. If you don't want to then I won't force you, but if you tell me there might be a way that I can help you." Kiba then looked at Tatsuya with a determined expression and then said, "I will tell you," and then started telling about the Holy Sword Project and his life. After he was done, Tatsuya looked at him and said, "You have gone through a lot." Kiba sighed and said, "Yeah." Tatsuya then patted on his shoulder and said, "Don't worry, everything is fine now." Tatsuya then became serious and said, "But do you think that your way of taking revenge is right?" Kiba became surprised by his question and then asked, "What do you mean by that?" Tatsuya then said, "What I mean to say is that, do you think that everything will be solved if you destroy all those great works lame swords?" Kiba was a bit confused by what Tatsuya said and seeing that Tatsuya sighed and then said, "Just think about it. Like someone destroyed the original Excalibur and then its pieces were used to make new Excaliburs. So, if you were to destroy the sword again, there is a chance that they can recreate them or worse, they can even make more swords with the new fragments and to choose wilders for those fragments a new Holy Sword Project will start and many children will suffer again. Do you really want that?" After hearing Tatsuya's explanation, Kiba started to hesitate about his revenge. Seeing the conflicted expression on Kiba's face, Tatsuya said, "I am not asking you to forget about your revenge. What I am asking you is to change the method of your revenge." Kiba immediately looked at Tatsuya intently, waiting for answer. Tatsuya then said, "How about killing the one who started the Holy Sword Project, Valper Galilei? After all, he was the one who made you and your friends suffer, right? Killing him will lessen the chances of another Holy Sword Project as well." Kiba remained silent for a while and then said, "I will think about it. Right now my head is in a mess." Tatsuya nodded and then said, "Take your time, there is no rush, you have the whole night to think about it." Tatsuya said with a smile on his face. Kiba twitched his lips and said, "Isn't that much time too less?" Tatsuya nodded and said, "I know that it is less, but as you have seen, that maniac Fried had an Excalibur in his hands. How do you think a stray priest will be allowed to possess one of the Excaliburs?" Kiba, who heard that, got surprised and started thinking about what Tatsuya said. He then said, "Yeah, now that I think about it, it is definitely weird for that priest to have that sword. It's as if..." Tatsuya then said, "Someone from the inside is helping him, and from what I know only people with certain authority will be allowed near Excaliburs like." Kiba then seemed to realize something and said, "People from the Holy Sword Project. They were allowed to take Excaliburs to test on us to know if anyone was worthy." Tatsuya then said, "That's right. I believe something big is about to happen, and seeing that the maniac with Excalibur was here, I can feel that this town is going to be the center of the events." He then sighed and said, "Why are they aiming this town? Can't they be happy on letting me relax?" Kiba showed a wry smile and then said, "Don't worry, we will go through everything together like brothers along with the others," and moved his fist forward. Tatsuya looked at him and bumped his fist and said, "Yeah, like brothers." Tatsuya and Kiba's stomachs then growled, earning a wry smile from both of them. Tatsuya then stood up and said, "I will fix something up." Kiba then sat back more comfortably and said, "Yeah, and make sure to make plenty." Tatsuya looked at Kiba and said, "Isn't this the time where you say, 'Let me help as well?' Or, 'No, I will cook,' or something?" Kiba shrugged his shoulders and said, "I know how delicious your food is, why would I want to deny such a humble offer?" Tatsuya sighed and said, "Bastard," and then went to the kitchen to cook. Chapter 109, The Exorcists. The next day, Tatsuya woke up early and decided to go to his house first before going to school, but just as he woke up he felt a certain presence and a smile appeared on his face and he thought, "So she finally came, huh?" He then got refreshed, left a note to inform Kiba on the table and then left Kiba's house. Just as he opened the door of the house, he was welcomed by a blur which he caught unconsciously and lifted up. The blur turned out to be Miyuki, and Tatsuya smiled and said, "Good morning, Miyuki," and hugged her. Miyuki hugged him back and then sniffed him and said, "You don't smell of a girl, so you really were at Kiba-san's house." Tatsuya then let her go and asked, "Yep, I was really at Kiba's place, but I didn't think that you would suspect me. You know that really hurts." Miyuki then hugged him back and said, "It's not like that, Oni-sama. I do trust you, but for some reason I have a feeling that some bitch will be coming close." Tatsuya, who heard her, had a sweat drop and thought, "Is this the so-called woman's intuition? She already felt that she is in town." Tatsuya then patted her back to calm her down, and then after a while both of them separated and both went inside the house to do their own work. Later that day on the way to school they met Rias and Isami, and Rias stopped the group and asked, "Hey, has any of you seen Yudo?" All of them looked at Tatsuya and said, "This guy was at his place last night, so ask him." Tatsuya looked at his group and said, "Don't speak like that or the others will misunderstand." He then looked at Rias and said, "And yes, last night I was at his place." He had quite a lot on his mind, so to see that he do not do anything rash, I decided to look over him. Rias nodded her head and said, "Thanks a lot. I was very worried after he left off without telling me anything." Tatsuya looked at Rias for a while and then thought, though she is an overconfident idiot, she still cares for her peerage. Tatsuya then nodded and said, "Mention not, he is my friend as well." All of them then started walking towards the school while talking to each other when suddenly Rias said, Oh yeah, we will be having some guests in the clubroom after the school is over. Isami looked at her and asked, guests? Is it something like your marriage again? Ria shook her head and said, no, nothing like that. 2 members of the church are coming to meet us. Apparently they have some work in our territory. Just as she said that, the atmosphere around them started to get cold and all of them looked at Miyuki. Miyuki, who just heard the information, thought, guest from church, bitch. She then started laughing, which gave the creeps to whoever saw her, and she then said, so she finally shows up, huh? Now I know why I had this feeling since yesterday. Tatsuya then patted her head to calm her down and the atmosphere turned back to normal. She then looked up and saw Tatsuya smiling at her, and she then realized, Oni-sama, you already felt her presence, don't you? Tatsuya shrugged his shoulders and said, well yeah, after all she still has the necklace that I gave her, so I sensed her presence this morning as soon as I woke up. Miyuki then asked, then why didn't you inform me that she was back on town? Tatsuya just smiled and said, well, I thought that you would be more surprised if you see her directly and it would be more fun to watch your reaction, and just continued to smile. All of them around both of them were confused about what both of them were talking about. Tatsuya and Miyuki noticed their stares and Tatsuya asked Miyuki, should we tell them? Miyuki thought for a while and said, nah, just let them be. They will meet soon anyways. Both of them nodded and again started walking towards the school, leaving behind a group of girls complaining to them about not telling what they were talking about. Later at the end of the day, Tatsuya and the others were in the ORC clubhouse. Kiba was there as well and all were silently sitting on the sofas with Tatsuya and his group in the corner and the Grimmery group in the center waiting for the guests to come. Soon the door of the clubroom opened and 2 people wearing white robes came inside. The 2 people who came were girls, one having chestnut brown hair tied in twin tails and the other with short blue hair with a streak of green in them. Both of them then took their seats facing Rias. The chestnut-haired girl then looked at Tatsuya and soon as if she remembered something she jumped from her seat and immediately came towards Tatsuya and hugged him and said, Tatsuya, I missed you so much. Tatsuya hugged her back as well and said, I missed you as well, Irina. How have you been? Irina then separated herself from Tatsuya and looked at him and said, I have been well, but what are you doing here? Tatsuya was about to answer but Miyuki beat him to that and said, is that even a question? It should be easily understandable why we are here. Looks like you are just as stupid as before. Irina then looked at Miyuki and said, and I see you have just the same sharp tongue like the old days, Miyuki. Both of them were smiling but everyone could see some sparks clashing between them. Miyuki then became neutral and said, anyway, it's nice to meet you again, I guess. Oh, and we are here because we are also a part of the supernatural, just so your small brain could not have realized it yet. Irina continued to smile and said, oh no, I understand. Her gaze then fell on Isami and she asked, are you Isami? It's been a long time. Isami looked at her in disbelief and said, you can't be Shido. Shido was a boy, not a girl like you. Irina then pouted a bit and said, says the one who matured even more than me. Isami was about to continue, but then the blue-haired girl interjected and said, Irina, I think the work that we came for is more important. Irina nodded and then went back to her seat and so did everyone else. Seeing that everyone was sitting, Rias said, nice to meet you, I am Rias Grimmery. The blue-haired girl nodded and said, Zenobia Corda, and this here is my partner Dash. Irina then waved both her hands and said, hello, I am Irina Shido, but some of you must already be knowing me. As she said her full name, the other girls of Tatsuya's group suddenly realized something and said, oh, you are the clingy bratty bitch. Miyuki has told us about you. It's nice to meet you. Irina's brows were twitching, and she looked at Miyuki and said, looks like you told them a lot about me. Miyuki smiled and said, oh, not really. After all, there wasn't much to tell them about some trash. Irina's lips were twitching, but she calmed herself down and said, don't become restless, it must be a trial that God has set up. Miyuki then placed a hand on her cheek and said, oh my, I didn't know that you regarded me as a god. Irina had veins popping out of her forehead and she thought, I really want to slice her apart. Miyuki just continued to smile in response. Chapter 110, The Talk. Seeing that they were not about to stop any moment soon, Tatsuya decided to intervene and said, Miyuki, stop that. Can't you see they are here for some important business? Look at Corda-san, she is itching to say something. At this, all of them looked at Zenobia, whose brows were twitching because of the commotion caused by the 2 girls. Miyuki then sighed and said, yes, Oni-sama, I understand. Sorry, Corda-san, please tell us what you want to discuss. Zenobia looked at Tatsuya and gave an appreciative nod, to which Tatsuya responded with a nod as well. Zenobia then said, thank you for arranging the time to speak with us. Rias kept a neutral expression and said, no, you don't need to thank me. I also wanted to know what the followers of the god want from a devil like me. Irina then said, out of the 6 swords that were under the security of the church, 3 of them has been stolen by the fallen angels. This surprised most of the people standing in the room except for Kiba and Tatsuya, who already saw Freed wielding an Excalibur. Zenobia then said, out of the 3 remaining swords, the ones we have are. She then lifted a huge sword covered in bandages and said, the Holy Sword of Destruction, Excalibur Destruction. After that, Irina took her hand out of her cloak, and while pointing at a thread tied around it said, and the Holy Sword of Mimicry, Excalibur Mimic. After announcing about their swords, they paused for a while, thinking that everyone must be surprised on learning about their swords, but those who were shocked were a select few. Aside from Rias and her peerage, except for Isami, none of them were excited that much. Isami herself possessed a Longinus and knew that how strong her sacred gear could get, and the weapons that Tatsuya's team possessed could easily outclass those holy swords. While this was going on, Tatsuya looked at the holy sword with uninterested eyes and thought, this universe's Excalibur is not that much of a big deal. Sure, they may cause great damage to beings who are weak to holy element, but that's it. Nothing more than that. The specific ability that each holy sword gives the user is also not something of that importance. For instance, I can consider Excalibur Transparency and Excalibur Ruler to be a great sword, but those effects could be gained by other magical tools as well. If I were to compare, my dick is a lot better than these swords. I can change the shape and size of my it, just like the Excalibur Mimic, and if I were to thrust my dick once by removing half of the limiters on my body, I could at least level half of the town without any problem. I can even make it tougher than Diamond using enhancement magic. Tatsuya then came out of his thoughts when Miyuki asked, "Hey, is that thread your holy sword?" Irina nodded her head and said, "Yeah, this is my holy sword. It can turn into anything." Miyuki then said, "Then couldn't it be stolen too easily? They just have to bump into you and loosen the knot and boom boom the sword is lost." Irina was completely shocked by what Miyuki said and then looked at her arm and said, "Now that you mention it, what you said does seem to be true." She then thought for a while and said, "Then what should I turn this into? Because any accessory could be taken easily by an expert pickpocket." Tatsuya looked at her with a neutral expression and said, "Then change it into a pair of panties and wear them. No chance of someone stealing or accidentally dropping it." The whole room fell silent and Irina was blushing deeply while covering her face and said, "How can you say those words in front of a pure soul like me?" Everyone was looking at Tatsuya, who looked back at them and said, "What? It is the most threat-proof way. If you can give me a better idea, then speak up." Everyone in the room looked at him for a while and then Zenobia gave a fake cough to get everyone's attention back to her and then said, "Anyways, what I want to say is that we don't want any interference of devils. It is a matter between the church and fallen angels." Hearing her words, everyone in the room was shocked and Rias became slightly agitated. She then glared at Zenobia and said, "Is that an accusation? Are you accusing us to be siding with the fallen?" Zenobia glared back at Rias and said, "Aren't the holy swords detestable to you as well? Your intentions align well with them." Rias got more angry at that and started releasing her demonic energy. Tatsuya looked at the scene in front of him and thought, what they are saying might be true, but they can also be accused to side with the fallen to take out the devils. After all three factions are not currently in any form of alliance and are hostile to each other, and among the three devils have the largest population because of reincarnated devils. Also, the holy swords cause major damage to devils rather than the fallen angels. Well, let's keep our mouth shut here. We don't want to interfere in their businesses now, do we? Zenobia remained calm even after Rias was releasing her energy and said, "If any of you were to interfere, we will annihilate you without any mercy. Even if you were the sister of a Mao." Tatsuya looked at Zenobia and thought, if she were to do that, forget the church, even the heaven will be ruined by a siscon. Rias then stopped releasing her demonic energy and said, "If you know that much about me, then let me tell you this. There is no way that I will align myself with the fallen angels. I will never do something that will tarnish the name of the House of Grimory or the Mao." Zenobia then smirked and said, "It's enough for me to hear that. I was just relaying the thoughts of those at the headquarters." Rias then eased her expression a bit and said, "Then it should also be clear to you that I have no intentions of siding with you as well." Zenobia nodded her head and said, "Of course, it is enough for us that you promise to not interfere in anything that happened in this town." Rias then thought for a while and then said, "I understand." Zenobia and Irina then stood up and said, "Thank you for taking out time and listening to our request." Rias then said, "Won't you have some tea before you go?" Zenobia shook her head and said, "No thanks, we are not here to make friends with devils," and started to leave along with Irina but soon stopped on her tracks and looked in the direction of Tatsuya's group. She then said, "I have been suspecting this since I entered the room, but aren't you Asia Argento?" Asia was a bit surprised by this and said, "Yes." Zenobia then narrowed her gaze and said, "I didn't think I would meet a witch at a place like this." Asia became a bit surprised but only a bit, and then she regained her expression. Irina, who now remembered who she was, looked at Asia and said, "Oh, you are the former saint who turned into a witch, right?" "Yes." Irina then continued and said, "I heard that you were banished from the church because you could heal fallen angels and devils, but I didn't expect you to side with the devils." "Yes." Zenobia then said, "But for the former saint to side with devils, you sure have fallen to the lowest you can." Asia didn't said anything, but Tatsuya and his team could feel that Asia was a bit pissed now. Zenobia, who didn't felt anything, said, "Do you still believe in God?" Asia looked at her without any hesitation and said, "Yes, I still believe in God." Zenobia then closed her eyes and said, "Then let me execute you right here, right now. Even if you have sinned, God will still reach out his hand for forgiveness." At this, Tatsuya and his whole group got pissed, and the girls were about to attack Zenobia. But before the situation got worse, Tatsuya came forward and said, "Zenobia, right?" Zenobia nodded her head in response, and Tatsuya then looked at her with a cold expression which sent a chill down on everyone's spine in the room and said, "Do you want to meet your so-called God so soon?" Chapter 111. Numbers are still growing. The whole room was completely silent. Everyone in the room, even Tatsuya's group, was scared of the look in Tatsuya's eyes. Tatsuya, who noticed that, reduced the coldness in his expression but was still glaring at Zenobia. After he relaxed his expression a bit, all of them feel a bit relaxed as well. Zenobia now also glared back at Tatsuya and said, "Why are you siding with the witch?" Tatsuya got angrier and said, "What right do you have to call her a witch? If she isn't a witch, then what is she? For a person referred to as saint, to side with the devils. She even has the powers to heal devils and fallen angels. Oh, then what about you? Do you mean to say that your oh-so-great holy sword can't hurt a person who is a follower of God?" At this, Zenobia gritted her teeth and then said, "That's not what I mean to say. What I meant was that she used her powers to heal a devil while she was a saint. It was not her fault that she healed an injured person that came in front of the church she was staying in. The higher-ups from your church has never taught her about how to differentiate between races. And just tell me, how can a devil enter the headquarters of the church and you exorcists just let them roam freely? In my opinion, all the fault lies with you exorcists who allowed a devil to get away, and instead of accepting your faults, you all just banished her from the church. Not even a single one from your pathetic bunch came forward to help her." Zenobia got agitated when she was called pathetic and said, she was a saint. She don't need help from anyone. She don't need any friends. She can just live on her faith in God. If she just wanted friends, then she should have never become a saint in the first place. Tatsuya's glare intensified and he said, oh, so now you were saying that she don't need help because she was a saint. Looks like you were misunderstanding something here. Asia never asked to become a saint. She was made a saint, and do you know why? Because the higher-ups of your pathetic bunch didn't want to let go of her after seeing their ability. They gave her the title of the saint not because they thought that she was blessed by God. They gave it so that they can get hold of her. Zenobia gritted her teeth and said, she have suffered because her faith in God is fake and must be banished because of the same reason. Oh, now you say because her faith in God was fake. Then why did you people label someone whose faith was fake as a saint? Zenobia was then left speechless. She didn't have any way to retort to him and just stayed silent. Tatsuya, who saw that, smirked and said, and even if I say that I believe you that her faith was fake, do you think that the church will take claim of you if I report that 2 of the church officials and holy sword wielders that were found in a devil territory without any prior permission? Because seeing that the church only sent 2 people to claim their precious holy swords, I can only guess that they sent you to not be in any kind of suspicion. Hearing that, Zenobia gritted her teeth and said, there is no way that the church would do something like that. Tatsuya smirked again and said, do you think that a person who is capable of stealing the holy sword from right under the nose of the church would be someone weak to be dealt by only 2 people of your level? It's obvious that they don't want to take any risks and sent you here on a do or die mission. They must have said some crap like, only an Excalibur can fight against an Excalibur, or even if you are not able to retrieve the sword, make sure to destroy them, so that they are not left in the hands of devils and fallen, right? Zenobia was shocked on hearing what Tatsuya said, as these were the same words that the church officials said to them before sending them on the mission. Tatsuya, who saw her remain silent, said, looks like I was correct. The church indeed said those words. Honestly, how pathetic of you to actually believe in them and take this kind of mission. The church dared to call of a good and pure person like Asia, which when the people who are having the authority there are monsters. Zenobia was now very angry and pointed her huge sword, which was still covered in bandages, at Tatsuya and said, you, just what are you to Asia? Tatsuya put a hand around Asia's waist and pulled her close to him, making her blush, and said, I her friend, her family, and the one who is going to protect her from the church and people like them who are taking advantage of her kindness. Just lay a hand on her and see how I fuck you up. As he finished that, the girls from Tatsuya's group said, you do look cool, but you forgot that I am the one who will marry her in future part. Tatsuya looked back at them and said, that was not needed here, and then looked back at Zenobia and said, yeah, and what they just said now as well. I will be marrying her in future. At that moment, Tatsuya could feel Irina releasing killing intent at him, but he ignored her. Zenobia, who was still glaring at Tatsuya, said, are your words directed only to us, or you are making a declaration against the whole church? She then smirked, thinking that Tatsuya will feel scared. But opposite to her expectations, Tatsuya simply smiled and said, this is neither directed to you or the church, it is directed to the whole world, and don't think that I am just feigning it. If I were to get serious, believe me, none of the so-called factions will be in existence. He said the last part in a cold voice, making all of them shudder in fear, except for Asia, who was in a pure bliss while being in Tatsuya's embrace. Zenobia then looked at Grimmery and said, how can you let a mad person like him live in your territory? Tatsuya chuckled, making Zenobia glare at him, and then said, you seem to not know this, so I will tell you. It is not Grimmery who is letting me live in her territory, it is me who is allowing her and the Citri heiresses to live and supervise the town in my stead. At the sudden information, both Zenobia and Irina were shocked. Tatsuya then said, you know, I was willing to let you do your work in the town, but now I think I should just report you and let you get banished from the church, and gave a sincere smile full of amusement. But to Zenobia and Irina, his smile looked very dangerous. If it was before, they couldn't have thought that the church could banish them, but after hearing Tatsuya's reasoning, they thought that there was a possibility of getting banished. Tatsuya, who was looking at Zenobia with a confused expression, suddenly felt a tug on his clothes and turned his head to see who was asking for his attention. When he turned his head, he saw Asia, who was still in his embrace, looking up at him. Tatsuya forgot all about the argument that he was having with the exorcists and hugged her tightly and said, oh, Asia, you look so cute. Just when Tatsuya hugged her, Asia's blush deepened, and then fumes started to run out of her when he called her cute. Asia then composed herself and said, don't report them and get them banished. It will hurt someone who have faith in God a lot. I know this from experience. It feels very bad to be asked to stay away from the only thing that you have been taught for your whole life. Miyuki then came closer to him and said, and even though I don't like her, she is still a friend, I guess, while pointing at Irina. You won't want her to go through trouble, right? Hearing both of them, Tatsuya sighed and then said, just go and do what you want. But remember this, you even try to harm someone close to me, you will live a life that will make dying look pale in comparison. Hearing that, both Irina and Zenobia looked at Tatsuya and said, thanks a lot. Zenobia then looked up and said, but the conditions are still the same. Don't interfere or we will kill you. Tatsuya and his group snorted at her and said at the said time, like you ever could. Hearing them, Zenobia gritted her teeth but controlled herself and said, we should be taking our leave then. Irina then came near Tatsuya and hugged him and said, sorry for all this trouble. Tatsuya hugged her back and said, it's okay, the church has just made both of you narrow-minded. Irina then separated herself and pinched Tatsuya's waist and then said, don't badmouth the church, I will not forgive you even if you were the person I like. Suddenly Irina remembered something and asked, by the way, I just heard earlier that you were going to marry Asia-san. Tatsuya just said, yeah. Irina continued to smile and said, then what about Miyuki, are you not going to marry her? This time Miyuki came forward and said, did you hit somewhere, or what? Of course Oni-sama will marry me. Irina then looked at Tatsuya and said, How many girls are there that you're going to marry? The girls from Tatsuya's group then said, about 20 for now, and the numbers are still growing. Tatsuya looked at the girls and twitched his lips. Irina, who heard that, was shocked and said, you have become way too corrupted, Tatsuya. For all the time I left you here alone, you became a bad person. Seeing her dreadful expression, Miyuki smirked and said, oh, just so you know, Oni-sama and I did the things that husband and wife do after marriage. Hearing that, Irina snapped and said, unforgivable, unforgivable, you come out right now. I will purify you with my holy sword, while pointing at Miyuki, who just laughed and seeing her expression. Seeing them, Zenobia said, Irina, just leave them. We have more important things to do. Irina glared at Zenobia and said, Zenobia, right now this is the task of utmost priority. Zenobia sighed and said, seriously, you want to fight them? Kiba, who saw that there was a chance to fight against the Excaliburs, came forward and said, why not I take you up on the challenge, with his killing intent fully set into the Excaliburs. Zenobia looked at Kiba and said, who are you? Kiba just smirked and said, your senpai. Chapter 112, Duel with the Exorcists. Right now all the people who were inside the ORC club were outside in between a forest for the unofficial duel against the two exorcists. On one side were Irina and Zenobia with their cloaks still on, and on the other were Miyuki and Kiba, with Miyuki smiling and Kiba radiating his killing intent. Rias and Akino looked at the situation in front of them with a worried look on their faces and asked, is it all right to have a duel against the church exorcists? Won't there be any serious circumstances later? Tatsuya looked at them and said, don't worry, there would be no problems. As I said earlier, the church is ready to get rid of them the moment they are caught by the higher-ups. The ones who are in a bind are them, not us. Hearing him, both of them relaxed a bit, and then looked back on the four standing in the middle. Zenobia looked at the group in front of her and said, now then, shall we begin? And both Irina and Zenobia removed their cloaks and revealed to be wearing skin-tight clothes which looked anything but holy at all. Tatsuya looked at both of them intently and then said, looks like the church is earning extra money from some unholy ways as well. Miyuki looked at Irina and then said, is that your uniform as an exorcist? Irina smiled and said, why yes. You must be enchanted by the holy me, right? Miyuki smirked and said, yeah, you are looking so holy that if you walk in the neighborhood wearing this, the men will assault you just to get you holy radiance. Irina, who heard her, was confused, and seeing that, Isami said, she is saying that you look like someone who works in adult videos. Hearing that, Irina became red and said, you dare make fun of such holy clothing? Zenobia, let's beat them real quick. And both Zenobia and Irina brought out their swords. Zenobia holding a huge sword in both her hands and Irina holding a katana. Seeing the holy swords, Kiba started to laugh maniacally and said, finally, I finally got the chance to destroy these swords, and then formed a lot of swords around him. And seeing that, Zenobia started to say her knowledge about the holy sword project. Miyuki ignored her and also brought out her sword and said, don't worry, I will try to not freeze you to death. But just as she said that, Tatsuya said, Miyuki, no magic allowed. It will be too unfair. Hearing that, Miyuki looked at Tatsuya with a pout on her face and said, you are too stingy, Oni-sama. Well, whatever. He church slut, you just got saved from being skewered by an ice spike. Do remember to thank Oni-sama. Irina looked at Miyuki and said, oh, please, like you can do that. Tatsuya looked at Irina and said, don't underestimate her, Irina. She has made a girl run around a mansion barely dodging the spikes while being completely naked. You could have been her next victim. Just when Tatsuya mentioned that, Ria shuddered and said, that was one of the worst experiences that I ever had, and I definitely don't want to go through that again. Irina then looked at Miyuki and said, I will definitely purify you with my holy sword. Amen, and jumped at Miyuki. Miyuki smirked and said, let's get this over with, and then immediately vanished from her spot, making Rias and her peerage, except Isami, and the exorcists got surprised when she vanished. Irina was looking around trying to find Miyuki, but suddenly she heard, where are you looking at? And her body got stiff. All of them looked at the scene in front of them with surprise, except for Tatsuya and his group and Isami. Miyuki was pointing her sword at Irina's neck and said, throw your sword away and yield. Irina gritted her teeth and said, I yield, and threw her sword away. Miyuki smiled and then hit Irina with a fist only to make her suffer some pain. Irina, who was thrown away, said, hey, what was that for? I already gave up. Miyuki just smiled and said, oh, my hands were just itching for a while. Irina grumbled in pain, but Tatsuya used his magic to heal her and then lifted her up. He then picked her sword and said, here you go, and gave it back. Irina took her sword back and looked at Tatsuya and said, thank you. Tatsuya just smiled and said, no problems. Miyuki then came towards Tatsuya and said, Oni-sama, how did I do? Tatsuya bonked her head and said, you overdid it. Miyuki looked at Tatsuya with a point and said, Oni-sama mine. Tatsuya smiled, looking at her pout, and then patted her head. All right. You did well. But don't defeat someone so easily. This can shatter their confidence. Only do a one-side annihilate when you want to crumble the enemies to dust. Show no mercy to those kind of opponents. Shatter their pride, break their bones. And if someone sexually harass you, then crush their balls. Miyuki smiled brightly while being in bliss on being patted and said, yes, Oni-sama. Everyone around them were looking the sibling pair with a weird look in their eyes and thought, how can they such things with a smile on their faces? Meanwhile, on the other side, Kiba was having a tough time against Zenobia. Even though his body has become strong and durable because of Tatsuya's training, he was still a devil and a major disadvantage against the holy sword. Kiba looked at Zenobia with an angry expression and said, let's see which destruction sword is better, your holy or my devil, and formed a huge sword and rushed towards Zenobia. Zenobia looked at Kiba with calm expression and said, you lost the one thing that was great about you. She then swung her sword and shattered the sword that Kiba was holding and said, your speed, and then hit Kiba's gut with a bit of force, just to make him give up the match. Kiba then fell on the ground and clutched his stomach. Zenovia then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Want to have a go against my sword, or are you scared now?" and smirked after taunting him. Tatsuya looked at others and said, "Do any of you want to fight, or is it okay for me to defeat her?" This made Zenovia glare at Tatsuya, but he just ignored her. The rest of Tatsuya's group just motioned to go and said, "Just defeat her and get this over with. It's already getting late." Tatsuya nodded and then went towards the field and stood in front of Zenovia. Zenovia glared at him and said, "I will show you the power of my Excalibur destruction." Tatsuya looked at her seriously and then said, "Okay, then I will show you the power of my personal dash." He then paused, making all of them look at him intently. Tatsuya, noticing their gazes, smirked and then said, "Spoon," and took out a spoon from his storage, making all of the people fall down dramatically. Zenovia then stood up and said, "Are you here to joke with me?" Tatsuya just smiled and said, No, I am not joking at all. Look here, my name is also carved on this spoon. This really is mine." Zenovia became more pissed and said, "Don't look down on me," and then jumped at Tatsuya. Tatsuya just sighed and said, "Starting the match with such a huge blunder. Sigh, I am very disappointed." He then took a casual stance and said, "Well, whatever, here goes nothing." Zenovia, who was reaching close to Tatsuya, said, "Are you giving up already?" "Sorry, but it's too late now, you will not get away from my sword." Tatsuya looked at her with a deadpan expression and thought, "Bitch, please, I can make you blow away with my sneeze." Tatsuya then moved his hand to the side. Zenovia, whose attack was about to hit him, smirked, but just when the sword was a hand's length away from Tatsuya, he swung his spoon, making contact with the sword, and said, "Full counter," lazily. Immediately, Zenovia was thrown away with a lot of force, crashing through a lot of trees. All of them except for Tatsuya's team were shocked by the sudden display and were awestruck. Tatsuya then said, "Now you should always remember this. Never mess with a person who have a spoon in the hand," and put his spoon back in his storage. All of them looked at him with a deadpan expression. Tatsuya looked at them and said, "What?" Hearing that, all of them twitched their lips but didn't said anything. Miyuki then said, "Oni-sama, what about not doing total annihilation that you just told me about?" Tatsuya looked at Miyuki for a while and then said, "Just consider it an exception." Miyuki and the others looked at him with an expression which said, "Really?" Tatsuya looked back at them with an expression which seemed to say, "Do you think that I give a damn fuck to what you think?" Seeing his expression, everyone was twitching their lips but were brought out of it when Irina said, "Don't you think that we should take her out of that rubble of trees before she die of suffocation?" All of them looked at the trees and saw a hand coming out of the logs. Tatsuya then said, "You still alive, Zenovia?" And the hand twitched a bit. Tatsuya then looked at others and said, "You should ho and help your friend. She can die there." All of them looked at him and said unanimously, "Who do you think is responsible for this?" Chapter 113, Getting My Hands Dirty. After Zenovia was taken out of the rubble, Tatsuya used his magic to heal her, and after a bit she stood up and lifted her Excalibur and wrapped it in the bandages. She then looked at others and said, "Thank you for taking your time and help us." She then looked at Tatsuya and said, "And I will beat you the next time." Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Sure, next time I will use a fork." Zenovia gritted her teeth but remained silent. She then put on her cloak and then looked at Irina and said, "Let's get going, Irina." Irina nodded her head and looked at others and said, "Well then, see you again, amen." As they were leaving, Tatsuya looked at them with a serious expression and said, "I guess that you both have already been told this, but you do know that you were up against a cadre, right?" Making all of them shocked. Both of them stopped in their tracks and looked at Tatsuya and asked, "How do you know that?" Tatsuya just shrugged his shoulders and said, "Don't forget that it is my territory. I at least know that if there are some major events going on in the town or not." Hearing his answer, Zenovia thought that it was justifiable, and Zenovia nodded and said, "Yes, we are already mentally prepared for what we are going to face. So don't interfere." Rias, who was listening to their conversation, curiously asked, "That means both of you do know who was the one who stole the swords, right?" Zenovia looked at Rias and said, "It was one of the leaders of Grigori, Kokobile." Hearing his name, all of them except Tatsuya were shocked. Rias now understood why Tatsuya asked that question and said, "Are you really prepared to fight a cadre? We can cooperate if we want to deal with him." Tatsuya looked at her and thought, "Even if all the supernaturals of the school except for me and my team group together, then two Kokobile can defeat them easily." Zenovia shook her head and said, "No, we can handle our problems on our own." Miyuki looked at Irina and said, "I already knew that you were stupid, but do really have to prove that by taking on this death mission." Irina looked at Miyuki and just showed a helpless smile and said, "Don't worry, I came here only after being prepared to deal with what we are going to." Miyuki, who was not satisfied with her answer, asked, "Does Tuji-san and Grace-san know that you have taken this mission?" At this question, Irina became silent and looked away. Both Tatsuya and Miyuki looked at Irina, and Tatsuya said, "Do you not really feel anything on taking this mission without even telling them?" Irina just became more depressed on hearing that. She then looked at both of them and said, "It doesn't matter. They would be happy if I completed this mission and come a step closer to God." Tatsuya narrowed his eyes and said, "And what about if you are unable to fulfill this mission? What will happen then? What if you die on this mission?" Irina, who was looking away, said, "Then I will die while doing something that the God wishes." Tatsuya got angry by her answer and was about to say something. But before he was able to, Miyuki walked towards Irina and slapped her and said, "Did this open your eyes a bit?" Miyuki then grabbed her shoulders and said, "Do you really believe that both of them will be happy on hearing about your death, even if it was for your God?" Irina teared up a bit and then freed herself from Miyuki's hold and looked at Zenovia and said, "Let's go." And both of them walked away. All of them looked at both of them go, and then Kiba also stood and was about to follow them. But Tatsuya stopped him and said, "Are you really set on your path, or are you going to follow the way we talked about yesterday?" Kiba looked at him with a conflicted expression and said, "I don't know. I cannot decide right now. At one time, I think that what you were saying is the correct way, but whenever I think of those swords, I think that what I am doing is correct." he said, and then left the group behind. Seeing that Kiba was leaving without telling them, Rias was about to stop him, but Tatsuya held her off by raising his hand and said, let him cool off a bit. His mind is in a mess right now. Rias then sighed and complied with what Tatsuya told her, and then left with her peerage. Tatsuya then looked at his group and said, you all go back first. There is something that I need to discuss with Sona. All of them nodded their heads silently and started walking back except for Miyuki, who remained standing. Tatsuya went towards her and hugged her and said, don't worry. Everything will be fine. I won't let anything happen to her even if I don't like to meddle this much. Miyuki slowly nodded her head and then snuggled closer to him while he just silently caressed her back. Soon she separated herself from Tatsuya and said, if you really want to help her then do it, but just so you know I don't care about her. Tatsuya just sighed and said, you know it's bad to not tell your real feelings, Miyuki. Miyuki looked away and said, I don't know what you were talking about, and then started walking back home. Tatsuya looked at their direction for a while and then looked at the setting sun and said, looks like I am getting my hands dirty in this case, and stretched while body. He then took out his phone and called Sona. Sona, it's me Tatsuya. You see there are some important matters that I need to discuss with you, so are you free right now? Great. We'll meet you in the student council room in a bit. Tatsuya then put his phone back and then started walking towards the student council room. Chapter 114. Serious Matters. After walking for a while, he reached the student council room and knocked on the door and entered before the people inside could have replied. Once inside, Tatsuya saw Sona and Tsubaki in the room, and Tsubaki came towards Tatsuya and gave him a peck on the lips and said, liked it. Tatsuya just smiled and gave her a peck as well and said, very. Sona looked at both of them with an annoyed gaze and said, Tatsuya, don't you have manners to not enter a room till someone says you to? What would you have done if either of us were changing their clothes? Tatsuya looked at her with a serious expression and said, then I would have taken responsibility for you and would have married you in future. At this, Sona blushed and looked away and said, how can you say that with a straight face? Tatsuya just walked towards her and whispered in her ear, because I am serious about it. Hearing her whisper, Sona shuddered and looked at him, but just as she turned, Tatsuya kissed her on the lips, making her blush deeper. Tatsuya looked at the blushing Sona and said, you look very cute when you feel embarrassed, Sotan. Sona, who heard the nickname, was red to her ears and covered her face with her hands. Seeing that, both Tatsuya and Tsubaki laughed, but after a while Tatsuya said, well, keeping that aside, I have something to discuss with you, and this matter is quite serious. Hearing him, both Tsubaki and Sona became serious, and Sona looked at Tatsuya and shifted her glasses and said, is it related to those church people that came to the town recently? Tatsuya nodded and said, yeah, and then started explaining them about why those two came to the town. After Tatsuya was done telling them about the purpose of the exorcists, Sona started to think and said, this can turn into a major problem. Tatsuya nodded his head and said, it has already become. Just think about this. The fallen stole church's holy swords and are now in a territory which belongs to the two devil heiresses who are also sisters of Amal. What do you think will happen if the situation takes turn for worse? Sona and Tsubaki's expression turned grim, and Sona said, it might lead to a new war among the three factions. Tatsuya nodded and said, it most likely will, and I think that's what the fallen are aiming for. Sona nodded her head and said, but if their plan is to start a war from the beginning, then it would be correct to say that they have already gathered an army of sorts to initiate their plan. Tatsuya looked at her and gave a small smile and said, not having one will be nothing but plain stupid. Or the person we are going to face must be quite a powerhouse. Sona then began thinking and asked, what do you think that we should do about this? Tatsuya looked at her and said, we should start by informing the leaders of the three factions first to prevent any major dispute in future. But we have a problem there as well. Most likely this mission is carried out by the church without the instructions of the heaven. So we cannot contact heaven. Sona became slightly worried but soon calmed herself down. She then massaged her temples and said, let's leave it for now. How are we going to inform the other two? I can inform my sister, even though I don't want to, but I understand the importance of this mission. Now how are we going to contact the leader of the fallen angels? Tatsuya patted his chest and said, leave that to me. He then took out his phone and called Azazel. Soon his phone was picked up and, hello, Azazel here. HHH. What happened? *** you harder. Do it har for asterisk. For you to *HHH ya fuck me asterisk. Call me. Tatsuya, who could hear the noise clearly, have guessed what Azazel was doing. Well, are you free in the evening? There is something that I want to discuss with you. Sure *AHHHHHHH asterisk. See you later, and ended the call. Tatsuya looked at Sona and said, he was kind of busy at the moment, but don't worry, I will talk with him later. Now let's call Sarah. Sona sighed and thought, I am probably gonna regret this. She then formed a magic circle on the table and a small projection of Seraphal in her magical girl costume appeared. Seraphal looked at Sona and got happy and said, my Soden finally called me on her own. What is it? Did something happen to you? Or you have realized your feelings of love for Wani-chan and want to do eki things together? But sorry Sotan, you are too late now. I do love you, but I have decided to do those things with Tatsuya-chan now. But don't you worry Sotan, I will ask Tatsuya-chan to let us do those things with him together, and while we are at it you can fulfill your fantasies of having fun with me as well. Tatsuya and Tsubaki, who were out of sight of Seraphal, were clutching their mouths and were trying very hard to not let their voice leak out from laughing. Sona, who heard her sister, was totally embarrassed and covered her face with her hand and said, Wani-sama, it's nothing like that. What I want to discuss with you is a very serious matter. So Tatsuya and I decided to discuss it with you. Seraphal, who heard Tatsuya's name, got surprised and asked, Tatsuya-cha is there as well? Tatsuya then came in her sight and said, hey Sarah, how are you doing? I hope that you are fine. Seraphal smiled brightly and said, hello Tatsuya-chan, I'm totally fine. I am a magical girl after all. How have you been? Tatsuya smiled and said, I am fine as well. Thanks for asking. Serafall nodded and said, so what is it that Soten said that you want to discuss with me? Hearing that Tatsuya became serious, and so did Sona. Tatsuya then said, how should I put this? Hearing his tone, Sona looked at him and thought, the matter is very serious. Even Tatsuya is finding it difficult to explain the situation to them, as they have entered a devil territory without any permission. Tatsuya then looked directly into Serafall's eyes and said, Sarah, I think that this information will be too surprising, but try not to freak out too much. Sona nodded and thought, yeah, it might be too much for her as it involves a possibility of leading to another great war. Tatsuya then sighed and said, apparently Sona is pregnant with my child. Sona nodded and said, yeah, Wanisama wa, what the hell did you just say? While she looked at Tatsuya with a deep red blush on her face. Serafall blanked out for a while when she heard what Natsuya said. Sona looked at the projection in front of her and saw a lifeless Serafall there. She looked at her with worry and said, no, Wanisama, what Tatsuya said is not true. We haven't done any D-dash. Just as she was about to continue, Serafall snapped out of her stupor and said, why did Soten get to have sex before me? Sona looked at Serafall and shouted, you were worried about that. Not that I did it, but because I did it before you. Serafall looked at Sona and shouted, of course, I have to maintain my dignity as the older sister by either doing it before you or doing it together with you. Tsubaki then shifted her glasses and her glasses were reflecting the light falling on them, making them shine, and then said, and of course I as a queen have to make sure whether what you would be doing will be safe for you or not and have to test it before you. After all, it's my duty. Sona and Serafall, projection, looked at Tsubaki and shouted together, duty my ass, and then the argument among the three girls started. Meanwhile, Tatsuya, who was looking at the three of them, thought, I should not have said that. Well, whatever, this is interesting as well. He then sat on the sofa in a relaxed position and then took out popcorn from his storage and then began enjoying the scene in front of him. Chapter 115. Worry. After all three of them calmed down, Tatsuya then discussed about the real problem with Serafall, and Serafall said that she would discuss with the other mouse first. Tatsuya then left and went to Azazel's place to discuss the matter, and he said that he would send Valet to take care of Kokobile once he returns back from a mission. He and the other cadres could not come because after receiving this information they now had to check the Grigori Thruли for spies and other traitors like Kokobile. Tatsuya didn't said anything to him as he knew that it was important, as checking the whole faction will take too much time, and that was the thing they couldn't afford to lose at the moment. After completing all his work, Tatsuya went to his home and discussed the matter what all he did with his team. While talking, Ingvild's and Tatsuya's gaze fell on Asia, who looked a bit troubled, and both decided to ask her later. After everything was over, all of them decided to go back to bed, but Ingvild and Tatsuya looked at Asia and said, Asia, wait, at the same time. Both of them then looked at each other and said at the same time, you noticed it as well, and both of them then chuckled. Asia looked at both of them with a confused look, and both of them looked back at her with a smile, and Tatsuya said, let's go to my room first. Ingvild nodded, and both of them held one of Asia's hand and pulled her towards Tatsuya's room. Once they were in Tatsuya's room, both of them released Asia's hand and looked at her and asked, what were you thinking a while ago? Asia's face changed its expression for a bit, but then turned back to normal and said, what are you both talking about? I am completely fine. Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then flicked her forehead. Asia then touched her forehead and said, it hurts. She looked at Tatsuya and said, why did you do that? Tatsuya moved his hand and flicked her again. This time Asia had tears in her eyes, and Tatsuya said, does this bring you back any memories? Hearing that, Asia stopped crying and then began remembering. She then said, oh, I remember now. You flicked my forehead even the first time we met in Vatican. Tatsuya nodded and said, yeah, we met each other, then apologized, and I flicked your forehead, and after all those mess when you finally decided to join my team. Tatsuya then looked at her in the eye and said, and at that time I promised that if you're in my team, you are my family and I will not let you get hurt. But how am I going to help you if you don't tell me what is the problem? Hearing that, Asia looked down feeling guilt and embarrassment, and seeing that Ingvild placed her hand on her back and said, look, we are here for each other and no one will feel that you are bothering them in any way. If you have a problem, then we can deal with it together. Asia then started to tear up, and seeing that, Tatsuya hugged her and said, look, Ingvild, you made Asia cry. Ingvild looked at him and said, I didn't do anything to her. She must be crying because of your forehead flicks. Tatsuya then said, you should not put the blame on someone else for your mistake. Ingvild twitched her lips but decided to let that be. Soon Asia stopped crying and said, I am sorry for letting you see me like that and making you worried. Both of them shrugged their shoulders and said, it's fine. Now tell us, what is the problem? Asia nodded and said, you see the things that those exorcists said to me about me being a witch and me being expelled because of the lack of faith in God. Somehow those words make me think whether what were they saying was true or not. Is my faith really fake? Ingvild and Tatsuya looked at her and said, of course not. You are one of the few pure people that I know. How can your faith be fake? And let's just say that your faith is fake. But does it really matter? Hearing his question, Asia looked at Tatsuya and said, what do you mean by that? Tatsuya said, just remember the times when you were in the church and healed someone. What would they do after the treatment? Asia thought for a while and then said, they would usually thank me and smile at me. Tatsuya nodded and said, yes. And did you feel happy when they would thank you and smile at you? Asia again nodded her head, and Tatsuya said, then does it really matter whether your faith was fake or not? All those people were happy and smiling at you, not the God, and I think the work of a saint is to heal the injured and bring a smile on their faces and not having the greatest faith in God. Asia looked at him for a while. Indy smiled, and seeing that Tatsuya and Ingvild smiled as well. Tatsuya then leaned closer to her and said, and if your faith was not fake, then how would you have been here with us? Asia just smiled and nodded her head. Seeing her face so close to Tatsuya, Asia blushed and then looked down in embarrassment. Tatsuya smirked and said, what happened? feeling embarrassed. Asia's face blush intensified when she heard what Tatsuya said. Tatsuya then smirked and said, well, you asked me at the party to let you accompany me at the night, right? Let's do it. Asia, who was taken aback by surprise, looked up and was immediately pulled into a kiss by Tatsuya and widened her eyes in surprise but soon melted in the kiss. After a few minutes they still continued to make out, and seeing both of them enjoying themselves for a while, Ingvild got annoyed. After she finally lost her patience, she said, how long are you both going to do that? I want to turn as well, and pulled Tatsuya away from Asia and smashed her lips on Tatsuya's. Asia, who was in a momentary daze and had a flushed face because of the kiss, soon came out of her stupor. Tatsuya then grabbed Ingvild's breast and started to slowly fondle them, and seeing that Asia came closer to Tatsuya and pulled him away and started kissing him once again. Ingvild was moaning in pleasure and looked at Tatsuya and started to take his shirt off and blushed on seeing his body. Tatsuya, who noticed her taking of his shirt, decided to do the same as well and took both Asia's and Ingvild's clothes off, leaving them only in their underwear. Tatsuya then made them lie down on the bed side by side and then looked at them, who blushing furiously. Seeing their embarrassed expression, Tatsuya gulped his saliva and said, it's going to be a long night, and then used his magic to make a sound barrier around the room. He looked at both of them and said, ready? Both of them shyly nodded their heads, and seeing the look on their faces, Tatsuya finally gave in to his urges and then started doing them. Chapter 116. Starting the preparation. The next morning after waking up, Tatsuya felt some weight on both of his arms. He turned his head and saw Asia and Ingvild sleeping on his arms with a peaceful expression on their faces. Tatsuya smiled as well and then gave a peck on their foreheads to each of them. He then used his psychic powers to lift their bodies a bit and then moved his hands away and then placed them back softly. He then went out of the room and did his daily workout and got refreshed after that. All of them then had their breakfast and then went to school. In the school, Tatsuya could see that the atmosphere around the heiresses were quite tense. Rias worried about her night and Sona worried about the talk that they had yesterday. Tatsuya then sighed and said, things are pretty tense for all of us, I guess. Psywitch Bastard decided to entrust the Excaliburs to the church. They could have simply kept them in heaven. This would have saved them from being stolen, and all of this would not have happened. During the break, Tatsuya and his group along with Isami were talking to each other, and Isami then said, hey, do you guys have any information about Kiba? I am starting to get worried a bit now. Tatsuya shook his head and said, I have not seen him since then. But I am planning something to do about both Kiba and the situation somehow. Tatsuya then noticed Saji walking by and then said, Saji, come here for a bit. Saji, who heard Tatsuya's voice, looked at him and immediately started running towards him with a trail of dust cloud rising behind him. He then stopped in front of Tatsuya and then gave a salute and said, you asked for me, Tatsuya and Iki? All of them looked at him with a weird expression, and then Tatsuya said, there is something that I want your help with. Are you free after school? Saji nodded his head and said, yes, Aniki, I am free after the school is over today. Just tell me the location where I have to come. Tatsuya nodded and then said, don't worry about that, I will send it via text. Saji nodded and said, yes, Aniki, and then went back. All of them looked at Saji's back, and Isami said, that dude sure is your lackey. Tatsuya just shrugged his shoulders and said, well, he treats me that way. I think of him as my friend. Let's go back to the class, and Miyuki, make sure to tell Kaneko to come as well. And tell her not to inform anyone about it, not even Rias and Akino. Same goes for you, Isami. Isami nodded and said, don't worry, I will not tell a single soul about it. Tatsuya nodded, and then all of them went back to their classes. Later that day, after the school was over, all of them went to a cafe and then waited for everyone to come. Once everyone was present, Tatsuya then said, since everyone is here now, let's begin. The reason I called you all today is because of the recent events that have been taking place in the town. You all must have heard about them, right? All of them nodded, and then Tatsuya said, since you all know about the situation, you all must also be knowing how critical the situation is. One wrong step, and then a new war starts. We cannot take any reckless steps if the situation turns into a war. All of them then became serious and nodded their heads. Tatsuya nodded his head as well and said, so we should take as many reckless steps as we can before it turns into a war. He said that, making all of them fall dramatically. Tatsuya then said, because without those reckless steps the war is inevitable. All of them turned serious again, and then Tatsuya said, what I am planning is to cooperate with the church and help them collect the Excaliburs before Kokobile could do anything. All of them were shocked, but the ones who were shocked the most were the devils. Tatsuya nodded his head and said, I know that some of you are unwilling to cooperate with them, but it is the most efficient way for us to deal with the situation. Kagura, who was confused by that, asked, what do you mean by efficient? We have already enough people to search for those sorts. Tatsuya shook his head and said, no, we don't. Because the ones who are going to search for them would be the devils, those exorcists and Kiba. You along with the others will be working on protecting the town. There may be an army of stray fallen and starred exorcists in the town, and we need to deal with them, or there will be a lot of people who would be in danger because of them. All of them then nodded, and then Saji raised his hand and said, Tatsuya and Iki, not being rude, but why am I involved in this as well? Tatsuya looked at Saji and said, you were the only reliable person left in the school who can work with us, and didn't you listen? The only thing that we are lacking is numbers to search and deal with the enemies. Saji was a bit sad by his answer and slumped his shoulders. Tatsuya, seeing that, said, but it does not mean that you are not useful, Saji. You said it yourself that you took 4 pawns to get reincarnated, so you must show them your true worth. Hearing that, Saji became a bit spirited, but then he realized something and asked, but won't we get in trouble for taking such aggressive actions? There is also the case of President punishing me. Tatsuya snorted and said, there will be no problems. This is my territory after all. If they have guts to raise their voice and hand against me in my territory, then I will tore them away. And regarding your punishment, that is none of my business. Just say something like I made you work for me by force or something and you would be safe. With a whisper, I guess. Saji looked at him with a wary expression and said, "Still, you are asking me too much. There is a chance of losing my life in the mission. Aniki, please show a bit mercy." Tatsuya nodded and said, "Yeah, I know that there is the possibility of dying in this mission, but think about it, Saji." Tatsuya then placed his hand around his shoulder and then waved his other hand and said after placing a sound barrier around him and Saji, "Once you successfully complete this mission, you will become famous among the Devil Society for resolving a matter of this importance. Fame, money are one thing many young female devils will also come close to you and would want to have your seed. Do you still want to let go of this opportunity?" Saji looked at Tatsuya with fear in his eyes and said, "Aniki, I couldn't believe that you will think so much for me. I am touched. I will forever follow you. Forget me, even the children that will be born from those devils. I will teach them to follow you as well. Don't worry, I will make you a lot of followers. You just have to wait." Tatsuya looked at him and thought, just a small push, and he like this now. Well, whatever, as long as he helps. I don't care whether he fucks a devil or Miltan. It is up to him. Meanwhile, the girls who couldn't hear what Tatsuya was telling to Saji looked at both of them, and Himari asked, "What do you think that both of them are doing?" Isami then started rubbing her chin and said, seeing how big of a devoted lackey he is, he must be asking Tatsuya to either fuck him or being fucked by him. All the girls looked at Isami and thought, really, that's the first thing that comes to your mind. Miyuki suddenly turned serious and said, "Then let's cut his filthy prick and seal his ass before he is able to violate Oni-sama." All the girls except Isami looked at her and thought, and you actually believed her. Suddenly Saji, who was talking to Tatsuya, felt a sudden chill pass through his body and thought, why do I have a feeling that something bad is going to happen to me? Chapter 117. Police. After it was decided what everyone will be doing, Tatsuya said, "Well, the first step is done now, let's go and find those two exorcists." Tatsuya then looked at his group and said, "All of you return back and start your preparations. We all have to start the operation tonight." All of them nodded, leaving behind the devils and Tatsuya. Tatsuya then looked at the other three and said, "Well, let's start searching for those two." All three of them nodded and the search for the exorcists started. They all started searching, and while walking, Isami asked, "Isn't it going to be difficult to find those two in the whole town? I mean, even though they do stand out because of the robes that they wear, but still dash." Isami was about to continue, but Tatsuya interrupted her and said, "Found them," and pointed his finger towards a direction. All of them looked where he was pointing and saw two white robe-cladded people asking for money from others while saying things like, "Blessings on the lost lamb," and "We are pitiful compared to you. Oh Lord, please have mercy on us." Tatsuya looked at Isami and said, "You were saying something?" Isami sighed and said, "Just forget it." Tatsuya and the others then walked towards the two of them, and then Tatsuya said, "Are you both even trying to find the swords?" Both of them then looked at Tatsuya and were surprised to see him there. Zenobia then said, "It's none of your business how we do our mission. Now if you are done, just leave already." Tatsuya smirked and said, "Oh, and here I thought that both of you were hungry and didn't have any money on you and thought to give you a treat, but it seems like you both are trying to find the swords. You both are very diligent, I see." When they heard Tatsuya speaking about not having money, both of them felt a jolt pass through their bodies. They were happy when they heard that he was going to give them food, but when his sentence proceeded, both of them became stiff and not had the will to ask for the food. Tatsuya looked at them and said, "Hey, both of you, if you have time, then stop your lost lamb business for a bit. I need to discuss something with you." Hearing that Zenobia was about to agree, but Irina butted in and said, "Hey, how dare you talk about our lost lamb like that? It is considered a holy thing among us. Apologize to the lost lamb." Tatsuya just shrugged and said, "See, I don't have that much time. Like I said, there is something that I need to discuss with you too. I am even willing to offer you food." Hearing that both of them were tempted, but before Zenobia could agree, Irina said, "There is no way now that I can take the food from you after you have badmouthed the lost lamb." Tatsuya was a bit annoyed and said, "Come on, just forget it." Irina shook her head and said, "No, we are not going." Tatsuya twitched his lips and said, "Looks like you haven't changed a lot since the last time we met. Still the stubborn personally, I see. Then how about we make a bet?" Tatsuya said that and smirked and looked at the two of them. Irina and Zenobia looked at him with a confused expression and said, "What type of bet?" Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Just like you were asking money in the name of lost lamb, I will do something like that as well, and let's see who can get more money out of the two of us. If you earn more, I will apologize. If I earn more, then both of you are coming with me to talk." Hearing the deal, Irina smirked and said, "Deal." Tatsuya just smiled and said, "I hope that you do not cry later." Tatsuya then took Kaneko with him and started discussing something with her. Soon both of them came back and Tatsuya said, "We have 1 hour to see who wins." Both of them nodded, and then Tatsuya said, "The time starts now." Irina and Zenobia started their lost lamb stuff, and still people paid them no attention. Both of them started to get a bit depressed, but suddenly they saw everyone looking at them and were running towards them. Seeing that, both of them got excited, and Irina said, "Looks like they finally came to realize how great the lost lamb is." They kept looking at the crowd approaching them, but then something unexpected happened and the crowd went past them and started gathering around Tatsuya. Both of them got surprised and decided to see what was happening and somehow managed to cut through the crowd, and what they witnessed left their mouth open in shock. Tatsuya was standing along with Kaneko and held a banner which said, "Help the lost cat." And then Kaneko, who was standing with her usual cold expression, put a pair of cat ears on her hand and smiled a bit and said while tilting her head to the side, "Please ONINYN." All the men who saw that held their chests tightly and shouted, "Don't worry, we will help you," and started putting money in the basket placed in the front. Seeing the money pile up, Tatsuya smirked and said, "Never underestimate the power of cats. They are very dangerous, very, very dangerous." He then looked at the church duo, showed them a mocking smile. Both of them gritted their teeth, but now they knew that they lost their bet. Both of them sighed and looked at Kaneko, who was now imitating a cat and was showing to use her hands as paws. Tatsuya looked at the money which keep on piling up and thought, I should ask her to act as a mascot sometimes in the restaurant. After the hour was over, Kaneko stopped acting and turned back to her cold expression. She then looked at Tatsuya and said, that was really tiring. Tatsuya looked at her, who was still wearing cat ears, and immediately hugged her and started rubbing her cheeks with his. Kaneko, who saw that, immediately blushed but didn't said anything. Tatsuya, who was enjoying the moment, was suddenly pulled out of it when he heard, if you're done with that, I guess you have to discuss something with us. Tatsuya stopped rubbing the cheeks but was still holding Kaneko in his arms, making her blush, and said, yeah, let's go somewhere else and talk there. This is no place to discuss something important. He then lifted Kaneko up and started walking back. Seeing that all of them looked at him with a sweat drop but still followed them. Kaneko, who was embarrassed by all the states that both her and Tatsuya were receiving, asked, Senpai, can you put me down? Tatsuya didn't even wait for a second and answered immediately, no. Kaneko turned her head and looked at him and asked, and when will you put me down? Tatsuya looked at her with a determined expression and said, till I am satisfied. Kaneko blushed a bit and then asked, and how much time will it take for you to get satisfied while holding me? Tatsuya smiled and said, Kaneko-chan, if I were up to me, then I can hold you like this for my whole life. You are too cute for me to leave you. Kaneko's blush intensified and then said, TT, then you have to take responsibility FF for this NNYA. Hearing that, Tatsuya felt that an arrow pierce his heart and thought, KKKAAWWWWWAWAAI, and hugged her even tighter and started patting her head and said, don't worry, I am ready to take any responsibility you want. Suddenly he heard a voice and stooped, hey you there, stop for a bit and put the little lady down. We want to discuss something with you, mister, so let's go to the police station for a bit. Tatsuya looked at the policemen who were looking at him and were pointing to the car they were in. Tatsuya looked at Kaneko and Kaneko looked back at him. Both of them then looked at the police who were staring at him. Chapter 118, Valper Galilei. After Tatsuya was done persuading, using mind control, on policemen that he was not doing anything shady, both him and Kaneko immediately ran away. After confirming that no one was nearby, Tatsuya put Kaneko back on the ground and both sighed in relief. He then looked at Kaneko and said, that was really unexpected. Kaneko looked back at him and said, yep, agreed. Both of them then reached his restaurant and soon the other devils came along with the exorcists. All four of them glared at Tatsuya and Isami said, how could you leave us behind? Tatsuya looked at her and said, hey, it's not my fault. We got in some trouble. Isami looked at him with a confused expression and asked, what trouble? Kaneko looked at her and said, Senpai got stopped by the police who were thinking he was a Lullicon. Hearing that, all four of them looked at Tatsuya with a weird expression. Tatsuya looked back at them and said, what? I am telling you this beforehand. I do not regret it a single bit. Kaneko-chan was very cute. He said that in a very determined expression, making all of them sweat drop and Kaneko blush. Tatsuya then said, anyway, first of all, sit down and have something to eat, then we will talk. At this, all of them sat down and then ordered their food. Irina then looked outside the window and after observing for a while said, this place looks kind of familiar. Tatsuya looked at her and said, of course it does. It was your home earlier after all. At this, Irina became shocked and then started to look around through the window, and after confirming that what Tatsuya said was true, she sighed and looked at Tatsuya and said, so someone bought this place, huh? Sigh, I was thinking of buying this place when I became older and had substantial money for it. Tatsuya looked at her and said, to tell you the truth, I am the owner of this place. At this, Irina was surprised once again and said, you were the one who bought this. Why? Tatsuya just shrugged his shoulders and said, well, the area was quite large, and it was just beside my house as well. And don't worry, I have stored the house in which you used to live just as it was. So you just have to ask for the house and I will sell it to you. Irina still felt a bit bad about it, but then let it go and decided to buy the house later. Soon the food was served by one of Tatsuya's clones, and all of them except Isami were shocked on seeing another Tatsuya. All of them looked at Tatsuya with a confused expression and Tatsuya said, they are just my clones, they help me run this place. Don't fret too much and start eating. All of them looked at him for a while, then started eating. Just as they took the first bite of their food, they became shocked on seeing how delicious it was. All of them started gobbling up the food without taking care about the manners. After they were done eating, Zenovia looked at Tatsuya and asked, so what do you want to talk with us? Tatsuya also looked at her with a serious expression and said, I will get straight to the point. The deal we made yesterday about not interfering in your task. I take it back. We are joining as well, and we might also destroy the Excaliburs in the process. At this, the atmosphere turned tense, and Zenovia then glared at him and said, and do you think that we will let you interfere in our mission? Tatsuya glared back at her and said, it seems like that you are forgetting that you are in my territory. I can simply execute you, and no questions will be raised about it. I have already told you before, your church have already prepared themselves to get rid of you if you both get exposed. They do not care whether you're Excalibur users or not. At this, Zenovia fell silent and began thinking what to do, and after a while sighed and said, fine, I agree to the deal, but if we are able to secure an Excalibur then dash. She was about to continue, but Tatsuya interrupted and said, I cannot promise that. That decision lies with Kiba. After all, he is the only one who want to destroy those swords among us. Zenovia glared back at him and gritted her teeth but still nodded her head. Seeing Zenovia nodding her head, Irina became shocked and said, hey, what are you doing? How can you let these non-believers and devils cooperate in our mission? Zenovia looked at Irina and said, I know that, but remember that our chances of returning back are very less, and the higher-ups sent us fully prepared to sacrifice ourselves for this cause. Irina nodded and said, I know that, but isn't that the only thing that we the believers yearn for? Zenovia shook her head and said, My faith is not that deep. I agree that I do believe in God, but before that I am a swordsman, and I definitely don't want to die before I can take my revenge from him," and pointed at Tatsuya. Tatsuya was surprised by that and said, "Oh, I am impressed that you still have the motivation to fight against me after that defeat." Zenobia gritted her teeth and said, "Just you wait. I will defeat you soon." Tatsuya just waved his hand and said, Sure, whatever." He then looked at both of them and said, "Now then, since we have agreed, then let's start the operation." He then took out his phone and called Kiba to confirm his location, and at once all of them went to him. They all met in a park, and after everything was discussed, all of them started the operation with Tatsuya's team responsible for guarding the town and the devils and exorcists along with Tatsuya as the tracking team. Later that night, the exorcists separated from the group, and so did Tatsuya, who went his own way to find the Excaliburs. While searching, he came across many stray exorcists and fallen angels who only fell into the hands of total annihilation. Tatsuya didn't show any mercy to them and killed them without second thought. He had enough of these kind of trashes invading his territory, and if the devils are not sufficient for the cleaning, he decided to do this on his own. He was very angry to see that most of them had made permanent hideouts in the town, which only showed how inefficiently his territory was managed. He was very enraged by this, but what angered him more was that these hideouts were also being used to do many shady businesses, quite oftenly making it sure that the devils were not doing their work properly. Tatsuya, who saw the records that he gathered from these hideouts, decided to give both of them a chance, and if the results were to be the same, then he would reclaim the rights that he had over his territory. He did not care whether Surzex would be pissed by this act or if Sona will start hating him. He had enough of them playing ruler, and now he was not going to keep enduring all these things in his territory no matter what. Soon he received a message from Kaneko that they had found an Excalibur. Hearing that, Tatsuya stopped his extermination and teleported to Kaneko's location. Seeing him teleport there, all of them stopped and looked at him, and once his figure was clearly visible, Freed pointed his sword at him and said, "Ah, it's the distracting dog shit human Cohen." Tatsuya looked at him and said, "Nice to meet you again, you priest of shit." Hearing his mockery, Freed laughed maniacally and said, "Ah, you are still the same. Annoying as hell. I will kill you first with my new baby," and showed his new sword to him. Tatsuya looked at him and said, "What happened to the old one? You dropped it somewhere." Freed looked at Tatsuya and said, "Most probably someone took it. We are not able to find its exact location." Suddenly he realized something and said, "Hey, don't ask such questions to me. I am not allowed to give you such answers." Tatsuya looked at him with a smirk and said, "And who gave you those orders?" Freed showed an evil smile and said, "Master Kokobile," and suddenly many Freeds appeared around him, making all of them surprised. Tatsuya immediately activated his Sharingan and saw that all the Freeds disappeared, only leaving behind one of them. Tatsuya then thought, that must be Excalibur Nightmare, able to create illusions and nightmares to people. Freed smirked on seeing that all of them were shocked on seeing that all of them were surprised on seeing the illusions. He then saw Kiba slashing through the illusions and smirked and jumped towards him to attack. But just as he was about to slash him, Tatsuya said, "Kiba, the one behind you is the real one." And Kiba immediately slashed behind him, making Freed block the attack. Freed gritted his teeth and jumped back and looked at Tatsuya and said, "You really piss me off." Tatsuya just smiled and said, "I know that. Ain't that fun?" Freed then glared at Tatsuya and then raised his sword and said, "I have decided now you will be the first person this sword will fuck up." Tatsuya shook his head and said, "Sorry, that is not possible." Freed then pointed his sword and said, "Why you think that I am not able to attack you?" Tatsuya looked at him with a neutral expression and said, "That too, and also I like to be the one who fucks, not the other way around," and smirked. Freed, who saw the smirk on Tatsuya's face, got annoyed and said, "I will wipe that smirk of your face." Tatsuya just continued to smirk and said, "You are free to try." Hearing that, Freed jumped while shouting, "Take this, human." He was approaching towards Tatsuya, but Tatsuya just remained standing at his place. Freed looked at him in anger and said, "Why you? At least be scared. There is no fun in killing you like this." Tatsuya ignored him and looked at his side and nodded. Just as Tatsuya nodded, Saji, who understood what to do, made a black-colored dragon gauntlet appear on his hand and shouted, "Absorption line," and a blue-colored shining rope launched from the gauntlet and entangled Freed in it. Freed looked at the rope restrained him and said, "What is this?" Tatsuya looked at him and said, "Oh, nothing. I just thought that you would like some bondage play. I hope that it is to your liking." Freed glared at Tatsuya and said, "No way in hell can I like something like this." Tatsuya looked at him with an astonished expression and then smacked his hand with his fist and said, "Oh, I know this much must not be able to satisfy you." He then looked at Isami and Kiba and said, "Hey Isami, give a boost to Kiba, and Kiba, use that energy to help our friend here to relieve himself. Slash him, cut him, pierce him with your swords. Do that till he is satisfied. I don't care whether you stick your swords in his ass, just make sure that he is completely relieved." Hearing that, all the devils looked at him with a weird expression, and Freed looked at him and said, "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing? I'm not into that." Tatsuya just smiled and said, "But don't you always say things like that to others, so why not try it for yourself? You never know what can make you feel relieved. Just try it. Who knows that you find a new path to your life." Freed, who saw his expression on his face, knew that Tatsuya wasn't kidding. He was seriously planning to do what he just said. Freed then got panicked and started to attack the rope with his sword, but all that effort was in vain. Seeing that Freed has started attacking the rope, Kiba and Isami got serious and did what Tatsuya told them. Kiba don't want to lose the opportunity that Tatsuya and Saji has created for him and was now ready to attack. Isami finished boosting up and transferred energy to Kiba. Transfer. After that, Kiba felt a surge of energy in him and smiled and said, "Thanks, I will use this energy to the fullest." He then pushed the sword in the ground and shouted, "Sword birth," and a number of swords started to appear from the ground around him and slowly started emerging in Freed's direction. Freed, who saw that, got panicked and stopped attacking the tongue-tied on his hand and started to destroying the swords around him. While he was busy in destroying the swords around him, Tatsuya felt someone nearby and said, "Won't you come out and join us?" As he said that, all of them got attentive and started looking around to see who was there. After waiting for a while, when the man did not came out, Tatsuya glared in his direction and said, "Come out while I am still being nice." Seeing the glare, the man shuddered and immediately came out of hiding. Tatsuya then stopped glaring and became neutral, making the man sigh in relief. Everyone then looked at the man, wondering who he was, and then Freed said, "Valper Gigi," hearing that, all of them were shocked except for Tatsuya, who now looked at the scene in front of him. Kiba glared at Valper and said, "Valper Galilei," with venom in his voice. Valper looked at him and said, "The one and only at your service, and I see that you were one of my test subjects from that time. Sword birth, a truly great sacred gear indeed, but nonetheless you were still unable to wield Excalibur." Kiba gritted his teeth and looked at Valper with an angry expression. Valper then looked at Freed and said, "And why are you suffering against a bunch of kids?" Freed, who kept on destroying the swords, pointed at his tied hand and was about to say something, but Tatsuya interrupted him and said, "Oh, we were just going to do something kinky, don't mind him. By the way, I have a question for you, shaved Santa-san." Valper then looked at Tatsuya and said, "And you there, you are still a human, yet your aura is still more refined than most of the supernatural beings. You will be a very good test subject. Oh, I can't wait to dissect you. Hey, tell me, what ability do you have? Do you have some sort of sacred gear?" Tatsuya just laughed lightly and said, "Sorry, I am not interested in my body getting touched, much less dissected by an old man like you." He was about to say something, but Isami interrupted him and asked, "Where is Cocoballs?" All of them looked at her with a confused expression, and Valper asked, "Sorry, but who is Cocoballs?" Tatsuya then said, "I will do you one better. Why is Cocoballs? And yes, where is Kokobeel?" Valper just started laughing and said, "Do you really believe that I will tell you where Master Kokobeel is? Do you think that I am an idiot?" Tatsuya didn't even wait for a second and said, "Yup," making Valper sweat drop at that. Valper then coughed and said, "Anyway, leaving that aside, Freed, passed your aura through the sword and then try cutting." Freed nodded and then passed his aura through the sword, making it glow, which made all the devils around him feel a bit nervous because of the holy aura. Freed then smiled and said, "Oh, shiny," and then he slashed the rope, cutting it without any problem. He then looked at the sword and said, "Oh, yeah, I like it." He then looked at the others and said, "Shitty devils and annoying human, let's continue the cutting," and then launched at Kiba and slashed at him, only to be blocked by another sword. All of them were surprised by the new sword that blocked that attack and looked at the person who blocked the attack and saw Zenobia standing there. She then glared at Freed and said, "Freed Selzan, the heretic priest who even killed his allies, truly a despicable person." Freed then showed an embarrassed expression and said, "Oh, don't say that, it's making me blush." Zenobia then gritted her teeth and pushed him away, making him fall back. "Hi, you called for us." All of them turned around to see Irina in her skin-tight uniform. Isami looked at her with surprise and said, "How did you know that we were here?" Kaneko then said, "I called them, it was the plan after all." Isami looked at Kaneko and said, "Good job, Kaneko-chan." Valper, who now saw two more holy sword users, got worried and said, Freed then looked at Valper and said, "What now, Gigi?" Valper then said, "Your job was to take care of the spies of the church, but now that more Excalibur users are here, let's get away." Freed looked at him with a disappointed expression and said, "So soon, but I wanted to slice some of them apart." Valper then narrowed his eyes, making Freed sigh and said, "Fine, Gigi, let's go." He then looked at the others and said, "See you later, shitheads," and then threw a flash bang on the ground, eloping both him and Valper in a blinding light, but before they were able to get away, Tatsuya again took his sword and stored it in his storage. Once the light died down, Kiba and the exorcists gritted their teeth and ran away, searching for them. Chapter 119. Playing Ruler. After Kiba and the exorcists were gone, Isami and the others were about to follow them, but suddenly two magic circles appeared, and the kings and queens of both the peerages appeared there. All the devils who saw them got surprised and were a bit scared by them. Both of them then looked at their peerage members and said, "My, you all are such naughty children." All of them then went inside the building, and both the kings were about to scold and punish their servants, but before they were able to start, Tatsuya came forward and said, "Just stop, it's not their fault, I am the one who made the plans." Sona and Rias, along with their queens, looked at Tatsuya, and Rias said, "Even though you were the one behind it, they are still my servant dash." Before she was able to continue, Sona interjected and said, "Is it related to the thing that we discussed yesterday?" Tatsuya ignored Rias as well and looked at Sona and said, "Yes, it is. I am sorry for taking Saji without your permission, but it was urgency. We needed numbers, and that too quickly. Waiting and discussing the whole matter with you would have taken too much time." Sona nodded and said, "I understand, but don't take my peerage members without my permission next time." Tatsuya just smiled and said, "No promises, that depends on the situation." Rias looked at their interaction and got a bit annoyed and said, "Hey, don't ignore me, and what is the thing that you discussed with her yesterday?" Sona and Tatsuya looked at Rias and gave an annoyed sigh. Sona then shifted her glasses and said, "It was something related to the things that are happening in the town recently. The things are not that small that you are imagining them to be." Rias, who saw both of them sighing, got angry, which only increased after Sona finished talking. She looked at both of them and narrowed her eyes and said, "If the situation was too dangerous, then it seems to be, then why wasn't I included in the discussion you two had yesterday? This is my territory as well." At this, Sona got a bit panicked and didn't know how to explain the situation to her. She then looked at Tatsuya and saw him look at Rias intently and thought, "No, Tatsuya, don't do what I think that you are going to do." Tatsuya, who heard her thoughts through telepathy, looked at her with an expression which said, "I don't give a fuck about that." He then looked at Rias and said, "Even if we have invited and explained the situation to you, well, what have you done about that?" Rias looked at Tatsuya and said, "I would have solved the problem in my own way." "Ha ha ha ha, Tatsuya started to laugh, making Sona and the others more worried, but Rias only got angrier by that. After laughing for a while, Tatsuya calmed himself down and said, "Solve the problem in your own way, huh?" He then glared at Rias, making her flinch, and said, "Just like you solved the problems with the fallen angels by allowing them to do whatever they wanted to do in the town." At this, the entire atmosphere of the room got tense. All of them were shocked to see Tatsuya say that to Rias, but they couldn't do anything. After all, what he was saying was true. Rias glared at Tatsuya and said, "My actions at that time were correct if no dash." Tatsuya raised his hand and stopped her from talking and said, "Don't spout the bullshit about you not harming them, because it could have led to friction in between the factions and would have started the three-way war." He then put his hand down and glared back at her and said, "That is only the excuse that you keep on saying to neglect your duties. A person entering your territory without any permission and do whatever he wants couldn't be harmed because it could lead to another war. If so, why did you kill the group of fallen in the church? Wasn't it going to start your so-called war?" Rias and the others only remained silent, with Rias glaring at Tatsuya. Tatsuya then snorted and said, "Some devil you are to say that you are also the governing this territory. When it comes to duties, you are the least involved, and when it comes to taking advantages, you are the first person to come up. Those fallen angels were destroyed by Isami because I was the one who ordered her as a part of her training to let her gain real combat experience, and yet all the credit for it was taken by you." Rias only gritted her teeth but couldn't utter a word. Tatsuya continued to glare at her and said, "But do you know, because of your actions, you have gained one thing. Do you know what?" Tatsuya then looked at Sona and said, "And this time you were somewhat involved in this as well." Both Sona and Rias got confused and looked at Tatsuya. Tatsuya just looked back at them and said, "Because you let those fallen and exorcists live in this territory and do whatever they wanted, they have sent enough information about the territory to their leader, so now it has already come to a situation that can turn into war. Congratulations." Tatsuya said that and started clapping. This only made them more and more depressed and guilty, and somehow both of them felt like crying. Sobaki and Akino looked at Tatsuya and were about to ask him to stop, but before they were able to, Tatsuya glared at them and said, "I am not done yet." Both of them flinched and immediately backed down. They could feel that Tatsuya was really angry now and didn't want to mess with him. Tatsuya looked at both Sona and Rias and said, "During tonight's operation, I was on patrol around the town, and you know what, I came across a lot of shady supernatural groups who have made this town their headquarters and were conducting a lot of illegal business. Why do I have to take care of these groups when you are the ones who have asked to govern over the town and are officially the ones to do that? Weren't you the ones who wanted to live in this territory while governing it? So why is it that there are so many unauthorized people here in my territory?" He said the last part with a clawed voice. All of them flinched at the coldness in Tatsuya's voice, and immediately Sona bowed her head and said, "I am sorry about that, it will not happen again." All of them were surprised to see Sona bow her head, and Tatsuya looked at her and said, "I expect the same as well. Don't expect that I will show leniency towards you if you're in a relationship with me. If you have taken this duty, then make sure to fulfill it." Sona looked up and nodded her head. This was the first time that she had seen Tatsuya become angry and knew that the matter is quite serious to make him angry. She knew that it was mostly Rias's fault, but she didn't want to take any chances to make Tatsuya angrier. Tatsuya then looked at Rias and said, "Do you have to say anything in your defense?" Rias looked at him and said, "I didn't even know that there were those types of groups in the town. How do you expect me to take care of them?" Hearing what Rias just said, Tatsuya snapped and have her the coldest glare he possibly could and unconsciously released a bit of his aura, which made all of them feel suffocated. Tatsuya, who noticed that, soon controlled himself and said, "I am sorry." He then looked back at Rias and said, "So you didn't know that there were such shady groups in the town? I highly doubt that. You, who is technically a high-class devil, is not able to feel the presence of other species. If that is true, then I think that you are worthless. But let's just keep that aside. Sona here has also been clearing many such groups in the town, you know that." Hearing that, Rias got a bit annoyed to see that Tatsuya called her worthless, and that he knew that Sona did cleared some of the groups. Tatsuya then said, "But still, she was unable to clear all of them, and that is also not what I am pointing to. What I want to say is that, if Sona, who actually knows about the groups, was unable to clear them all, then wouldn't it be natural that she will discuss this problem with her fellow ruler to ask for help?" At this, Rias fell silent and didn't said anything. Tatsuya then said, "Let's even keep that aside too. Tell me, what could you have done even if you knew about these groups? Doesn't the result would have been same?" Rias looked at him and said, "What do you mean to say?" Tatsuya continued to look at her with an expressionless face and said, "I mean, didn't you did the same with the situation you knew about years ago but still didn't do anything about it?" Rias narrowed her eyes and said, "Which situation are you talking about specifically?" Tatsuya just smirking and said, "Your marriage contract with Riser, of course. You knew about that since a long time, but what did you do that to come out of it other than ranting about your situation?" Rias glared at Tatsuya and gritted her teeth. Tatsuya, who saw that, said, "What, the truth hit you hard?" Rias continued to glare, and then Tatsuya said, "In the whole raiding game, you couldn't even defeat a single opponent. Not only that, you even hindered the others by acting recklessly and put them in danger. Do you seriously think that if Isami was not able to achieve her balance breaker, any of you would have survived? Riser could have easily injured you pretty badly, if not burned you to ashes. Of your peerage would not have saved you." Rias continued to grit her teeth and glare at Tatsuya, but he completely ignored her and said, "You didn't even train when you were finally given the opportunity before the raiding game. Do you seriously think that you were that strong? Tell me, can you hold yourself against Freed while he is wielding a holy sword? No, you can't. But you know, Kiba held out against him, and twice too at that. I will say it bluntly, Rias, you are the weakest person in your group, and if you continue to be the same, you will hold back the others." He said that and then sighed. He then looked at her and said, "Stop being a spoiled princess. The world is not that peaceful and kind that you have experienced till now. You can die any time if you are not strong enough. It is also not only about you, but also the people who are under you and following you. He then released his aura and to make them feel pressurized and said, take example from the situation we are currently in. If you were to die in the current scenario of events, it will directly lead to the war. What would you do then? Rias was about to say something, but Tatsuya stopped her and said, and don't say that you can hold yourself on your own. Do you have confidence to hold against the cadre when you were unable to hold against even Riser? This made her silent, and she looked down in guilt. Tatsuya then calmed down and said, I will be helping you this time because this involves the town which is my territory, but how long do you expect someone to save your ass? Grow up, Rias, or you will die in this world. Also, I am taking back the ownership of the town from Rias Cremery. She and her peerage are allowed to stay and attend the school, but all the powers that you had about the decision-making of the town and authority have been taken from you. This made all of them shocked, and Rias said, you cannot do this. Tatsuya looked at her with a glare and said, I most certainly can. You are still not worthy of taking care of a town. You have put the lives of not only the supernaturals but also the normal humans as well. The enemy is aiming for war. He most certainly would be having an army, and if the war actually occurs, then many more innocents will die. He then gave her a final glare and said, I am done with you playing ruler in my territory. He said that and then teleported back to his home, leaving behind a group of speechless devils. Chapter 120, After the Scolding. After Tatsuya teleported home, all the girls came out to greet him, but were immediately stopped by Kurumi, who noticed the chaotic feelings welling inside him. Tatsuya just looked at the girls and said, please don't disturb me for a while, with the calmest tone that he was able to use at that time, and then went to his room. Once he was gone, Kurumi looked at the others and said, let's just do as he said. He is currently very angry about something. The girls looked at each other, and then all of them said at the same time, let's ask Isami or Sona about this, and immediately contacted both of them, and a small projection of the girls appeared in front of them. The girls, when saw the pale faces of the girls, now knew that something definitely happened and asked both of them about it. Sona and Isami also didn't hide anything from them, because even though they were shocked by how Tatsuya acted today, they knew that Tatsuya's reasons for acting like that were correct as well. They also wanted to know how Tatsuya was feeling as well, because they were worried for him. After they were done explaining, the room went silent, and then Kurumi said with a sigh, so he finally endured all of his limits, huh? Well, I was expecting this to happen sooner or later. Even if it looks like he doesn't care too much, he still cares for his territory. The territory certainly has worsened after he stopped maintaining it, but to think that it has turned this worse. Sona, along with Tsubaki, projections, felt guilty and once again bowed and said, we are sorry about that. Kurumi, who saw them apologizing, shook her hands rapidly and said, no, I am not blaming you because of this. I already know how much you work for this territory. If you work anymore, you will become sick, and that it will only make him worry. Hearing that, Sona and Tsubaki lifted their head and sighed in relief. Isami, projection, who was silent till now, said, but what will happen now? By how it looked to me, Tatsuya was certainly serious about taking back the authority from Prez. Won't it cause troubles with the devils, Surzek specifically? Kurumi then snorted and said, she should have thought about this before acting like a spoiled bitch, and if it is about conflict with the devils, it should be Surzek who should worry if Tatsuya is not too pissed, because if that happens, even the original Lucifer would not be able to save his sorry ass along with the rest of the devil faction. Hearing that, Isami, Sona, and Tsubaki got surprised and asked, is he that strong to be a threat to the whole devil faction? This time Miyuki looked at the projections and said, even if all the three great factions were to come at him together, he can easily wipe them from the face of the planet. Suddenly Isami's sacred gear appeared on her hand, and Drake then said, what they are saying is certainly true. I have experienced his power firsthand, and trust me, I don't want to experience that again. Even the Great War was pleasant compared to that fight. Drake then paused for a while and then said, Citri Eris. At this, Sona got alert and said, yes, Drake-sama. The gem on the gauntlet then glowed and said, your sister is a Mousewell, right? Contact her and explain the situation to her as soon as possible, and make sure to tell her to discuss it with the other Mouse as soon as possible, because we don't know what the Grimmery girl could do right now. She can even spout made-up nonsense right now. Tatsuya smashed her great who to pieces. She must not be in a proper state of mind. Sona nodded at this and decided to do that as soon as possible. She knew what the Drake was saying might be possible, and she didn't want to deal with what could happen after that. Tiamat, who heard what Drake just said, looked at Isami and said, I didn't know that a shameless and selfish dragon like you can do something like this. Why are you trying to save those devils? Drake remained silent for a while and then said, it is not for the devils but for me. If the devils were to go on a war against him, then my host will be put on the battlefield as well, and there is no way that I am fighting him. All of them looked at the gauntlet with a sweat drop, and Tiamat said, how can a dragon stay away from a fight? Drake didn't wait for long and said, I know that a dragon cannot stay away from a fight, but here this clearly a battle against him is not a fight but a total one-sided annihilation. You hear me? A total one-sided annihilation. He said the last part while shouting. Drake then calmed down and said, you too must have felt his power, right, Tiamat? Otherwise there is no way that you will become his mate. Tiamat nodded her head and said, yeah, I have felt that power, and I know how scary that power is, but the most dangerous part is that he is able to have such great control over it that we cannot feel it if he didn't show it. We dragons too cannot measure his power, but we can feel that it is dangerous. Drake nodded inside the gauntlet and then said, by the way, has he calmed down since then? Hearing that, Kurumi spread her senses and felt his emotions and said, he has calmed down a bit and is currently sleeping. He must be too stressed because of the war and all. Drake then said, why is he so much worried about the war? It's of like he will be entering the war or so. You are not a part of the three factions, and even if he somehow gets involved, can he get out of the situation pretty easily? Kurumi looked seriously at the gauntlet and said, if Tatsuya wanted something like world domination, do you think that he was unable to achieve it? He simply wants to have a peaceful life with his loved ones. But if this war takes place, there will be many people like Sona, Tsubaki, Isami, Sarah, and many more who is related to him somehow and will be in the war. And thus it would be better for him if the war doesn't start in the first place. At this Drake sighed and said, I too don't want another war. I have faced plenty of them now, and my only desire is to face off against Albion. Tia smirked at that and said, where? On the bed? At this Drake got panicked and said, don't tell me, Tatsuya told you. Tiamat just continued to smile and said, I think we should go back to sleep as well. Hey Tiamat, answer me. Did he tell you? Don't ignore me, Yodash. Before he was able to continue, Tiamat cut the connection and both the projections vanished. She then stretched her body and said, well, I am going to accompany him. He must be pretty worried. And entered Tatsuya's room, and soon one by one everyone was in his room. Chapter 121. Gods. The next day after Tatsuya woke up, he felt some weight all over his body and saw that all the girls were lying either on top or around him. He then sighed and let them sleep for a bit more and got out of there carefully without waking any of them. He then got down and made some coffee for himself and then sat down and slowly sipped on it. Tatsuya then began to think about what happened yesterday and then gave a tired sigh and thought, looks like I let my inner thoughts out yesterday. But it was not my fault. She was the one who was not taking care of my territory correctly, even though they were the ones who asked for it themselves. And because of my anger, I even gnashed out at Sona and Tsubaki even though they worked so hard to maintain the territory. He then started to feel a bit bad and then said, I will apologize to Sona and Tsubaki later at school, but first I have to talk to Amaterasu to take back the rights that Rias had over the territory. He then made a magic circle and called Amaterasu and said, hey Amy, sorry for calling you this early. Were you sleeping? Amaterasu, who saw Tatsuya, got happy and said, no, not at all, I was just about to go to my workplace. So what happened to make you call me this early? Tatsuya looked at her with a serious expression and said, please take back the deed that Grimoires had over the town back as soon as possible. Amaterasu, who heard that, got shocked and said, what? Are you serious? Tatsuya nodded and then started explaining about why he was asking such a thing, and once he was done, Amaterasu too was very angry. Amaterasu then said, she have some nerve to let such things happen in my territory. I mean, one can be irresponsible, but still there is a limit to it. Amaterasu then calmed down and said, but even so, you do know that it will cause some friction between the devil and Shinto factions, right? Tatsuya nodded and said, I know that, and I take full responsibility for it. If you were to go at a war with the devils because of this, then I will join your side. Amaterasu then smiled and then said, okay, then I will inform the others immediately, but still, are you sure about this? Tatsuya nodded and said, just explain the reasons and say that I was the one who observed the territory and asked you to do it. This will surely make the deal go much smoother. Amy then smiled and said, anyways, are there any plans of you visiting me, or should I come there? Tatsuya shook his head and said, right now I am too busy and this town is not safe, even though me and my team, and you can easily survive, the people in this town will surely not. So how about once the things are finished you come here, and then we can go on a date? Hearing that, Amaterasu smiled, which made Tatsuya blush, and he then said, you are looking very beautiful right now. Amaterasu just smiled and said, foo foo foo. I am glad to hear that. You two look very good without your shirt. Tatsuya just gave a tired sigh and said, the girls took it off at night. Anyway, how are Tsukiyomi-san and Susanoo-san? At this, two young men came in the projection and said, we are fine, brother-in-law. How are you doing? You have plans to come here? Tatsuya just gave a wry smile and said, not at the moment. I am still busy with a lot of stuff in the town, but once I am free, I will try to come there as soon as possible, Susanoo-san. Then the other man moved forward and said, you should refer us as brother-in-laws, and I hope that you are fine. Tatsuya looked at the man and said, I am fine, Tsukiyo, brother-in-law. Tsukiyomi smiled and said, so why did you call her, if you are not coming here? Was it for an important business, or it was one of your private talks? Sorry if we are interrupting you too. Amaterasu, who was looking at her brothers, blushed and said, it is nothing like that, we were discussing a very important topic before both of you came. At this, both Susanoo and Tsukiyomi laughed, but soon calmed and then turned serious and asked, what matter? Tatsuya and Amaterasu then started explaining what they were talking about, and Tsukiyomi and Susanoo went into deep thinking. Soon both of them opened their eyes, and then Susanoo said, okay, we will do what you want us to do, but don't turn back on your promise to help us. Tatsuya nodded and said, don't worry, I will not go back on my word. Tsukiyomi then said, also let's make the marriage contract between you and my sister official. Hearing that, Amaterasu blushed and said, hey, isn't it too soon? Tatsuya haven't even graduated from high school yet. Tatsuya then said, but I have graduated from my virginity. Amaterasu got even redder after hearing that and then remained silent. Susanoo and Tsukiyomi then started laughing, and then Susanoo said, yeah, you should at least get engaged. In my opinion, that too is still late. I clearly remember that one of my wives was even younger when we were married. He said with a prideful voice and then closed his eyes and started remembering those days. Tatsuya looked at Susanoo with a deadpan expression and said, then doesn't that mean that you are a pedophile? Susanoo did an anime fall and said, hey, how dare you call a god like that? Tatsuya looked at Susanoo and said, I am very sorry. Susanoo then nodded and then was about to say something, but Tatsuya suddenly said, I am very sorry, you are not a pedophile. You are a god of pedophiles. Susanoo's brows then twitched and said, you have gotten bolder, huh? Just don't let me catch you otherwise, dash. Tatsuya interjected him again and said, sorry, I only accept to be your brother-in-law. Even though you are a pedogod, I am still willing to have that relationship with you. Nothing more than that. I have no interest in males. Tsukiyomi and Amaterasu were laughing loudly at their brother while Susanoo kept on getting angrier. Susanoo then said, just come here and I will fuck you up. Tatsuya then looked at him with a disgusting expression and said, now you are a gay pedophile. Sorry, but I have no interest in you. Susanoo got even more pissed, but Tsukiyomi then came forward and said, "Stop it, brother, did you forget how badly you were defeated last time?" Susanoo grabbed his butt and said, "How can I forget that embarrassment? I still have problems when I try to sit. Why the hell did you use 1,000 years of death or whatever?" Tatsuya just shrugged and said, "You were being an asshole, so I just attacked there." All the three gods looked at him with a deadpan look and thought, "That's reasoning make no sense." Chapter 122, after the discussion. After talking a bit longer with the Shinto gods, Tatsuya ended the call and soon the other members of the house woke up and came down, and once they saw Tatsuya all of them went towards him and hugged him. Tatsuya was surprised by that but soon sighed and said, "Sorry for making you all worried." They didn't reply but still kept on hugging him. Tatsuya looked at their antics but let them do what they wanted. Soon the girls let him go, and then Tatsuya looked at them and said, "Once again I apologize for worrying you all." The girls looked at him, and then Kurumi said, "Don't worry about it. We came to know what happened out there. You must have been pissed off too much to even scare your cute little Soten a bit. She and Tsubaki along with Isami and Kaneko probably are a bit gloomy after your outburst yesterday. Make sure to apologize to them." Tatsuya sighed and said, "I already know what I have to do, you need not to remind me." Kurumi just chuckled and then said, "So, have you decided to take away the authority from the redhead?" Tatsuya nodded and said, "Yeah, I have already asked Amy and his brothers to do so as soon as possible. I guess soon the authority over half the town will come back to me." Ingvile then looked at him and asked, "But don't you think that the devil, especially Surzex, will be kind of upset about it?" Tatsuya looked at her and then said, "They can fuck themselves about it for all I care, and the possibility of Surzex taking aggressive actions about this matter are quite less. He may be a syscon. He knows quite well about who not to mess with, though the other devils in the council might take actions about it as it was in a way their territory in a place which is not underworld, hence making it easy for them to take actions. But that too is very less probable as Sona still has some part of the territory. So only those who try to butter up the grimoires will be a pain to deal with." Himari then asked, "And what will you do to those who try this?" Tatsuya looked at her with a smile and said, "The first time I might leave them with a simple warning, but if they keep on pestering me then dash." His expression then turned dark and he then said, "I will drown them in holy water and then electrocute them to death with holy lightning. If they still remain alive then I will again drown them in holy water, electrocute them with holy lightning, and then burn them with Amaterasu, and if still they remain alive dash." Sinan then put her hand on his mouth and said, Fine, I understand, you will kill them. Honestly, just throw them in the dimensional gap and they will die without any trace." Tatsuya then looked at her with a weird expression and then said, "Where's the fun in that?" All of them looked at him with a deadpan look making him twitch his lips. Miyuki then came forward and held Tatsuya's hands and then said, "Don't listen to them, Oni-sama. I will support you and will help you skewer those who come seeking trouble. We can marinate them in the holy water first, and then I will skewer them, and you can electrocute them with holy lightning as seasoning, and then we roast them in your flames." Tatsuya looked at her and then said, "Nice idea." And both of them smiled looking at each other. Meanwhile, all the others looked at the Shiba siblings and thought, "I don't want to imagine what will happen to Thode, who will become the ingredients for their dish." Shizuka then came forward and said, "Leaving all that aside, you said that you will be getting your authority over the territory soon, right? I will help you manage it whenever you are busy or at school. You need not worry about it." Tatsuya looked at her and asked, "Are you sure about that? It will be very hectic and sometimes it may be dangerous as well?" Shizuka nodded and said, "Of course, no problem with that, and even if the things were to go south, I can contact any of you immediately." Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then said, "Fine, but just don't get in trouble." He then turned serious and then said, "Okay, all of you listen, we need to work on patrolling the town tonight. I think that they are going to take actions tonight." All of them then turned serious and Karen asked, "Why do you think so?" Tatsuya looked at Karen and said, "When I was clearing out those groups last night, I came across a lot of documents as well." He then took out the documents from his storage and put them on the table. He then looked back at the others and said, "And after going through them, I learned that they were going to take action soon, but after my encounter with the one who started the Holy Sword project yesterday, I am certain that they will be taking actions either today or tomorrow because there is no way that they will let someone with that importance in the town before their plan is about to start." At this, all of them narrowed their eyes and asked, "And why do you think that this person is an important asset to them?" Tatsuya looked back at them and said, "Just think about it. They have stolen the holy swords which cannot be wielded by anyone who the sword don't choose worthy, and yet that free guy was able to wield 2 of them. How do you think that it is possible?" All of them then got shocked and now understood why Tatsuya was saying that they might attack today. All of them nodded and looked at Tatsuya with determination. Tatsuya looked back at them and gave a nod and said, "I have already told you this before, but this the stakes are very high, so make sure to find and kill each and everyone who is set on to start the war." They too gave a nod and then started to discuss how they were going to operate tonight. After an hour, or when they were done, all of them looked at Tatsuya, who looked back at them and asked, "What?" All of them shook their head and said, "Nothing, it's just that it's time to go to school. Are you willing to face them after yesterday's incident?" Tatsuya, who heard that, sighed and said, "I cannot remain hidden in this situation when we are almost at war, and I also have to apologize to Sona and the others. Also, I don't regret whatever I did yesterday. What I said was true, and it is certain that I don't feel bad about that redhead. Simply said, get ready soon, we are already late." All of them smiled and nodded and then immediately went to change their clothes. Chapter 123, Kokobile. When Tatsuya and his team reached the school, the first thing that they noticed was that there were a lot of mana fluctuations coming from the ORC. They all looked at each other and then said in unison, "Yup, the redhead is pissed," and looked at Tatsuya. Tatsuya just snorted and said, "Good for her. She might do more damage to the enemy if she is angry." Karen then said, "But won't she become a problem if she jumps in a fight recklessly?" Tatsuya looked at her with a deadpan expression and said, Karen, I think that you are forgetting that she is Rias Grimmery we are talking about. She will do the same even if she is not angry. All of them became speechless and then said, you do have a point. Tatsuya nodded and said, well, anyway, you guys go to the class. I will go to the student council room first. They all nodded and then headed to their classes. Tatsuya then started walking towards the student council, and after reaching there he knocked on the door. Soon he heard Sona giving the permission to enter, after which he opened the door and entered and saw that only Sona and Tsubaki were there. Both the girls were shocked on seeing Tatsuya there and were slightly hesitating to talk to him. Tatsuya, who saw their expressions, sighed and then bowed his head and said, I am sorry about what happened yesterday. I shouldn't have snapped at you both, but I was really angry at that time. You were not to blame, and I still did that. I am very sorry. Both the girls looked at the Tatsuya for a while and then sighed and said, just raise your head up. Tatsuya raised his head and looked at the girls who were looking at him as well. All of them kept staring at each other for a while, and then Tatsuya said, so, am I forgiven? Both the girls looked at each other, and then Sona said, what should we do, Tsubaki? Should we forgive him, or not? And smirked. Tsubaki, who saw the smirk on Sona's face, smirked as well and then said, I don't know, Sona. What should we do? He scolded his girlfriends so much when it was not even their fault. Isn't he too cruel? Sona nodded and said, indeed he is. She then looked at Tatsuya and said, so what should we do now? Tatsuya, who now knew that he was being teased, twitched his lips and then said, what can I do to make up for snapping at you two, my lovely girlfriends? Both Sona and Tsubaki looked at Tatsuya with an amused expression on their faces. Tatsuya, who saw their express, was somewhat regretting to come there. Sona then said, you want to do something to make up for your mistake, huh? But what should I make you do? Make you my butler for a day? Or make you carry my things on shopping? Just when Tatsuya heard the second option, his body trembled. Seeing his reaction, Sona chuckled and then said, you don't need to do anything, it was somewhat my fault as well, so I apologize once again for that. Tatsuya looked at Sona and smiled. He then said, thank you, but seriously, you really don't want me to do anything? Sona shook her head and said, yes, I don't need, and I think even Tsubaki agri-dash. Sona was unable to finish her sentence when Tsubaki said, then let's have sex after all this is over. Sona looked at her queen with a betrayed expression and said, why didn't you said that you will not do something till I am officially engaged to him? Tsubaki looked at Sona with a confused expression and said, huh, who are you? Sona became annoyed and said, don't, who are you, me? I am your king. Tsubaki nodded and then said, never heard of you. Don't get in my way now. She then looked away from Sona and then started walking towards Tatsuya, but soon Sona grabbed her and said, hey, you promised me that you won't do that. Tsubaki looked back at Sona and placed her hand on Sona's shoulder. She then shifted her glasses in such a way that the light was reflected from them and made the lens shine. She then said, listen, here in life you will get various opportunities where you may have to make your decisions with keeping your priorities in mind. Sona then looked at her and said, and your priority should be me, your king, right? You said that you will always help me when you became my queen. Tsubaki nodded her head and said, yup, and I am doing just that. I will check first that how it feels to do that. Is this painful or is it harmful? I will check it first so that you don't suffer in the future. Sona then said, if that's the case, then it should be me who should test that first. After all, I am your king. I can't push you to do something before knowing how dangerous the situation is, and then tightened the grip on Tsubaki's shoulder. Tsubaki and Sona then started glaring at each other, but then they were brought out of it when they heard a voice. Ano, President, Vice President, what are both of you doing? Both of them then turned around and saw the rest of the peerage standing there looking at them with a confused expression. Both of them looked around the room and then asked, where is Tatsuya? Saji then said, oh, Aniki, he just left the room and told me to inform both of you that meet him once both of you have come to a conclusion, and also T said that it is not the time to discuss such things. Do it after the situation at hand is over. Both of them then moved their hands back and Sona said, let's discuss it later. Tsubaki looked at her and said, what's there to discuss? I have already decided to do it. You are just standing in the way. Sona glared at her, which Tsubaki responded with a smirk and said, my king, let's not waste time, the classes are about to start, and then left the room, leaving behind an angry Sona and a confused peerage. Soon Sona calmed down and said, okay, everyone go back to your classes, but be alert at all times. The situation of the town is very dangerous, we cannot be reckless or death is for certain. All of them became scared, but still looked at Sona with seriousness and nodded their heads and left for their classes along with Sona. After the school was over, all the supernaturals of the school went to their respective groups and started their duties. Tatsuya looked at his group and said, you know what to do. Now let's split up. And then all of them nodded and then started moving in different directions. All of them started to search for any stray exorcists and fallen angels in the town and killing them in process, slowly decreasing the number of enemy forces. They kept on doing that when suddenly all of them felt a strong presence in the town. All of them contacted each other through their telepathic links to discuss what to do about the situation. You guys felt that too, right? Yep, this certainly must be their leader. He seems to be a cadre class. So what should we do now? Gang up on him and kill him? No, this will make him alert, and he might order the rest of the subordinates to cause ruckus in the town. So what shall we do? Wait for him to set everything up, and then when he is about to execute his plan, kill him. Nah, waiting that long isn't worth it. You all keep on doing what you are doing and increase the pace a bit. Most of the town is clear, just a few groups are left. Kill them and come to the location. I will go to make sure that no one tries to bite more than they can chew. Roger, we will come soon. Don't get scared out there alone. Ha ha ha, very funny. Now continue what you were doing. And all of TH then cut the connection, and Tatsuya teleported to the location where he sensed the presence from, while the rest of his team kept on doing the extermination. Soon Tatsuya appeared in a barrier-enclosed area and felt multiple presences around him. He then started walking towards the direction he felt the presences from and soon reached an area where he found the Grimmery group, minus Kiba, along with Sona and Tsubaki. He then looked up and saw a fallen angel with 5 pair of wings with black hair and pointed ears which he thought should be Kokobile. He then started walking towards the group, alerting the people there. Shitty human Koen is finally here. Now get ready to get sliced apart. Tatsuya then looked at the person who called him and saw Fried standing there smiling maniacally at him and was shocked. Not because he didn't saw him earlier, he had already sensed Fried was present there by his magic. What surprised him was that Fried was holding 2 swords in his hands, and from their aura he guessed the sword to be Excalibur Mimic. Tatsuya then looked around to see an injured Irina lying in Tsubaki's lap with most of her clothes shredded apart. He then immediately rushed towards her and started to check her condition and found that she was still alive. He then healed most of her wounds and covered her with a blanket which he took out from his storage. His expression then turned cold, and he started releasing his aura, making the people around him feel suffocated. He then looked at the group present there and asked, which one of you bastards were responsible for her condition? All of them who looked at his gaze shivered in fear. All of them then gulped their saliva, but still no one answered him because they were scared by the aura he was releasing. Tatsuya got annoyed by that and gritted his teeth and said, "Did you all not hear me? Who the hell among you was the one responsible for her injuries?" Kokobile, who was looking at Tatsuya, was drenched in cold sweat and thought, Shit. I didn't know that there was such a powerhouse in this town. I do heard Azazel talking to Valley about someone strong present in the town, but to think that someone of this power is in this town. If I go against him, then I will definitely die. What should I do? Should I run away? No, all the preparations that I have done will go down wasted. I cannot turn around now. Not without starting the war in the least. I should kill one of the sisters of the Mao, and that will be enough to ignite the flames of war. Tatsuya then glared at Kokobile after hearing his thoughts and said, "Don't even think about it?" Kokobile, who heard him, got shocked and was now completely scared of Tatsuya. Tatsuya, who noticed that, asked, "Are you the one who was responsible for her injuries?" Kokobile gulped his saliva and was cursing himself to not get the detailed information about the town. He then decided to maintain the brave front and said, "And what if I wa dash?" Before he was able to finish the sentence, half of his wings disappeared and were seen falling down the sky. "Hey, my wings." Tatsuya, who was now behind Kokobile, said in a cold voice, "Then you can count on this that your suffering will be worse than hers." Chapter 124, Question. Kokobile, who was now panting heavily, glared at Tatsuya and said, You filthy human, how dare you do that to me?" and fired several light spears at Tatsuya. Tatsuya, who saw the spears coming towards, didn't even move and used his psychic powers to crush the spears themselves, making Kokobile shocked. Tatsuya then looked at Kokobile with a cold expression and said, "Finished already?" Kokobile glared at him and gritted his teeth. He himself knew that he cannot beat Tatsuya, but his ambition to start the new war made him unable to run away. He then started a lot of light spears and swords around him and started firing them at without even aiming. Tatsuya looked at Kokobile and thought, so he finally lost the ability to think rationally and started to dodge the spears and swords while also sending some of his attacks in Kokobile's direction. Kokobile also started to dodge the attacks but was not able to dodge all of them and was heavily injured and severely bleeding. He then looked at Tatsuya with a glare, but suddenly his glare turned into a smile. Seeing his smile, Tatsuya got confused but immediately understood what happened and frowned. He then turned around and saw a lot of attack heading towards the devils. He was not that much worried about the devils as they were able to dodge the attacks or run away, but the thing that worried him was Irina, who was still unconscious. He immediately teleported in front of the group, destroyed a light spear heading towards Aquino, and formed a barrier in front of him blocking the attacks. He looked at Aquino and asked, "Are you fine?" Aquino, whose eyes were shut with fear, slowly opened her eyes and blinked in surprise. She then looked at Tatsuya, who was looking at her, and blushed, and immediately said, "Yes, I am fine. Thank you for saving me." Tatsuya nodded his head in response and then looked at the devils and said, "What the hell are you all still doing here? Just run away." Sona was about to answer, but Ria beat her to that and said, "We are not going, we will fight him as well. If he succeeds, then the whole town will be destroyed." Tatsuya looked at her and said, "Just run away, you will only get in the way." He then walked towards the unconscious Irina and then held her in her arms and then moved towards Kaneko and said, "Take her and make sure that she remains safe." Kaneko nodded and took Irina from Tatsuya's hands. Isami then came forward and said, "Is there anything that we can do?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "Just run away for now, and if possible clear any stray fallen angels and exorcists in the way." All of them nodded and Tatsuya looked back at Kokobile and immediately his eyes widened in shock only to turn into a glare. That idiot. All of them who saw that got confused and looked in the direction and saw Rias flying in the sky attacking Kokobile with her power of destruction. Kokobile, who saw that, smirked and thought, "I just need to kill her and my work is finished," and fired a huge light spear towards Rias, which pierced through the power of destruction. She fired easily and started heading towards Rias. Rias, who saw that the spear coming towards her, got shocked and thought, "My pride still came in the way," and closed her eyes waiting for the spear in her life. The spear was getting closer and closer to Rias and Kokobile was getting excited by each second. But just when the spear was a meter away from Rias, Tatsuya came in front of the spear and slapped it away. Rias, who didn't feel the pain she was expecting, opened her eyes and saw Tatsuya's back. She was about to say something, but Tatsuya turned around and slapped her, making all the people who were watching the scene surprised. Rias, who was holding her cheek, which was now red, was surprised as well, and then slowly turned her head to look at Tatsuya. Tatsuya looked at her with an expressionless face and said, "You do know why I slapped you, right?" But Rias didn't said anything and just remained silent. Tatsuya's expression didn't change at all, and he then said, "If not, then let me tell you. That guy is here to start a war, and the only way that he would be able to will be killing one of the sisters of Amal." Rias still silent and didn't said anything. Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then said, Stop being a bother and just get away from here. The war is the last thing that I want to happen. Think about your faults later. He then cast a genjutsu on her and made her unconscious. Tatsuya then took her and gave her to the others and said, get her out of here as well. They all nodded and then took Rias away and stood somewhere in the back. Tatsuya then heard some noise and saw Kiba and Zenobia fighting with Freed, who was holding a sword which he thought to be the combination of the two holy swords. He also noticed that Kiba had awakened his balance breaker and was holding the holy demonic sword while Zenobia was holding the Durandal. Tatsuya looked at Kiba and said, so you finally made the decision. Kiba, who heard him, turned his head and looked at him with a determined expression and said, yes, I will not let the strength that my friends have given me go to waste. Tatsuya gave a small smile and said, slice him apart. Kiba nodded his head and said, don't worry about that, I am in a much more hurry than you to do that, and then launched towards Freed. Tatsuya then looked at Kokubil, who was now barely recognizable, but he could feel immense killing intent aimed at him. Seeing that, Tatsuya smirked and said, is that all? You were going to start a war with only that much strength? Kokubil gritted his teeth and was about to say something, but before he was able to, his right hand and leg were cut off. Hey. Tatsuya, who was now in the air, was holding his missing hand and leg, then said, now all your left side is blank. No wings on the left, no hand on the left, no leg on the left. You are now a completely right person, and showed him innocent smile to him. Kokubi, who saw his smile, glared at Tatsuya and said, why the hell I, a great fallen angel, is being humiliated by the likes of a human. Tatsuya looked at him with a wondering expression and said, oh, you think that you are superior to a human? Then Mr. Superior, what if I give you a chance? Kokubil looked at him intently and asked, what chance? Tatsuya then said, I will ask you a question, and if you are able to answer it, I will no longer torture you, and will give you a painless death. Kokubil, who heard the deal, wanted to tell it him, but thinking about his condition, he gulped his saliva and asked, and what if I am unable to answer it? Tatsuya looked at him with a cheerful expression and said, I will heal you back to your original condition, and will again make you a right person. Hearing the deal, all the people looked at him with a deadpan look and all had the same thought, damn sadist. Tatsuya then said, now let's begin. Here's the question. All the eyes were set on him, and they were wondering what question Tatsuya was going to ask. Kokubil was also worried and silently sent a signal to call his troops. Tatsuya, who noticed that, didn't do anything, as he knew only a handful of them were left in the town, and they would be soon killed by his team. Tatsuya then gave a fake cough and said, so my question is, there is a person whose eyes are covered by hair. Tell me, what role is he playing? Your options are a mob character, a hentai protagonist, or a person who is enraged because the enemy pissed him off. There was complete silence in the surrounding. No one was making any movement and were staring at Tatsuya with a surprised expression on their faces with their mouths open wide. Tatsuya noticed that the surrounding around him suddenly turned silent and looked around. He then noticed their expression. Even Kiba, whose sword was piercing through Valper's stomach, was looking at him with the same expression. Tatsuya then looked at Kokubil and said, hurry up and answer. I don't have all day. Kokubil was twitching his lips when he heard that and was looking at Tatsuya with a hateful expression. The devils who were looking at him also twitched their lips and thought, he is very shameless. Chapter 125, Answer. After Tatsuya said that, all the eyes were at Kokubil, and noticing all the gazes at him, Kokubil started sweating and got nervous. Kokubil then lowered his head, said hesitatingly, it's one of those PP protagonists in those animated videos who do that, and covered his face with his only hand with a blush on his face. Seeing him acting like that, all the people who saw him were grossed out and had an unpleasant look on their faces. Tatsuya somehow regained his calm and said, WW, what is the answer? Say it clearly, and stop acting like a maiden. Kokubil, who heard that, became even redder and started shivering and said, LL, like I said, it's one of those animated videos in which the guy does SSSE. No, don't make me say such vulgar words. All of them got creeped out and then took a step back. Tatsuya placed a hand on his chest and started taking deep breaths and started muttering, calm down, Tatsuya, just think that you never saw that. Just imagine yourself surrounded by your girls wearing cat ears, yeah. Just cares them and pat them, yes, just do that. Tatsuya then again got calm somehow and said, listen, if you're going to answer vaguely, then I will give you the punishment right now, and you will die. Hearing that, Kokubil got scared and looked at Tatsuya and said, hey, I answered you. I said that it is the protagonist of those animated videos. Tatsuya then said, animated videos is the ones called anime. Kokubil immediately refuted and said, no, the protagonist of anime don't have such eyes. Their eyes are clearly visible and they become strong by poking on breasts. Hearing that, Tatsuya's eyes widened and he became silent. He got shocked by the thing that Kokubil just said and didn't know how to respond to it. Seeing that Tatsuya was silent, Isami came forward and said, that's no anime, that must be some sort of hentai. There are no protagonists in anime who become strong by doing that. This time Tatsuya looked at Isami with a weird look on his face and then thought, if only you knew, Isami, if only you knew. He then gave a tired sigh and said, well, the dash. Before he was able to finish speaking, Zenobia interrupted him and said, quit wasting time and just kill him, and jumped at Kokubil with her Durandal in her hand and slashed at Kokubil. Tatsuya, who saw that, looked at her with a deadpan expression and said, and here goes the musclehead. Kokubil, who saw the girl coming at him, got alert and caught her sword with his hand and glared at her and said, do you think that I am at that level that you can defeat me? Suddenly an evil grin formed on his face and said, well, anyway, thanks for buying time for me. You were at least somewhat helpful. He then took out a vial filled with some green liquid inside it and thought, I don't want to use it, but this is my only choice, and then opened the lid and then drank the contents in it. Tatsuya, who saw him bring out the vial, was somewhat curious to know what the thing was and didn't stop him. Once Kokubil drank, that veins started popping out on his body and his muscles started enlarging. Zenobia, who saw that, jumped back and said, what is happening? Tatsuya, who was looking at Kokobile, nonchalantly said, Kokobile is going to Mega Evolve to Mega Kokobile. All of them looked at him for a while and then looked back at Kokobile. Soon Kokobile started screaming at the top of his voice and started to emit some sort of light. Again Zenobia said, now what is happening to him? And this time too Tatsuya nonchalantly said, now he is turning into Super Saiyan 3. All of them once again looked at Tatsuya once again but soon looked back at Kokobile. Kokobile, who was done with his shouting and all soon stopped emitting the glow and was revealed to the others with a major change in his appearance. His whole body was now completely black with 3 eyes on his face, one being at the center of the forehead, and his severed limbs were now regenerated somehow. Tatsuya looked at him with an uninterested gaze and asked, so what was in that vial, cause I can feel some devil energy in you now? Kokobile looked at Tatsuya with a wide grin on his face and said, it's one of the results of the experiments that some of my underlings were working on. It consists of the DNA of many of those shitty devils. Tatsuya, who was still looking at him with a neutral expression, said, so you decided to rely on some devils when you were in deep shit. Well, pretty low for someone who wants to start the war with the 3 factions. Kokobile snorted and said, don't spout nonsense. I am the one who is grossed out the most. To think that I, Kokobile, who fought the Great War, would have to rely on the devils. This is very humiliating for me. He then looked at Tatsuya and said, but given the circumstances that I am in, this is the only way by which I can survive to start the war. Tatsuya looked at him normally for a while when suddenly a grin appeared on his face and he said, do you think that you can defeat me with that? Well, you are free to try on Bookie Kokoballs. Kokobile's grin widened and he said, oh, I will kill you, but before that dash, he suddenly blocked Zenobia again, who tried to slash him with her Durandal, and said, you should not interrupt men when they are talking to each other. Tatsuya snickered and said, says the one who was acting like a maiden just a second ago. But Kokobile ignored him and said to Zenobia, you truly are brave. To fight me even after your master is dead. Truly admirable. All of them who heard then got surprised, and Zenobia said, what do you mean by that? Kokobile, who heard that question, said, oh, how could I do such a mistake, to let it slip out? Well, whatever, it doesn't matter. The truth is dash. Just as he was about to say anything further, a bram of energy was fired at him and half of his body was immediately destroyed. All of the people got shocked and looked at the source of the attack and saw Tatsuya, whose hand was aiming at Kokobile's direction, and then he said, don't go ahead and spread information that is not needed. But soon Kokobile's body erupted in flames and he started healing. Kokobile that grinned maniacally and said, the power of the Phoenix clan is really great. He then looked at Tatsuya and said, so you already know, huh? Well, don't you think that it is unfair to not let the others know about the things that we do? He looked at Tatsuya with the same grin and started laughing. Ah. All the people then looked at Tatsuya and then asked, what the hell is he talking about, Tatsuya? Before Tatsuya was able to answer, Kokobile said, what I am talking about is, during the Great War it was not only the Satans who died but the god of the Bible died as well, and again started laughing. All the people there except for Tatsuya, Miyuki, Kurumi, and Isami got shocked. They were not able to believe what Kokobile said and were completely speechless. Suddenly all of them heard a voice and turned their head only to find Asia on her knees, who was being supported by Miyuki. Seeing the shock on their faces and Asia's condition, Kokobile started to laugh even louder, but suddenly stopped when he felt a huge amount of pressure on his body, and so was the case with the others. All of them then turned towards Tatsuya and saw him looking coldly at Kokobile while he was unconsciously releasing his power. He then looked at Kokobile and said with a cold voice, I guess you don't understand it the easy way, dash, and suddenly Kokobile was blown away by some invisible force. Tatsuya then suddenly appeared behind Kokobile and grabbed his head and said with the same cold voice, to be prepared to learn it the hard way, and I promise it will make you feel that death would be a boon, and crushed his neck with his bare hand.
That is all for today. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. If you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please drop a comment down below.